Our story tonight takes us to medieval Paris in 1180, the year of Philip Augustus's coronation. In the autumn of that year, a young man of 15 rode through the muddy streets to be crowned King of France. His name was Philip, son of Louis VII, and the modest royal town he inherited would grow to become one of the largest and most powerful cities in Europe. The Seine ran brown with autumn rain past wooden houses clustered on the Isle de la Cité, while beyond the old Roman walls, fields stretched northward toward the hill of Saint-Denis. The Petit Pont groans beneath your boots as you cross from the left bank toward the Isle de la Cité on a grey morning in late November. Rain has fallen through the night without ceasing, and the Seine below you has swollen to the colour of hammered lead, indistinguishable from the sky that presses low over the rooftops. The cold iron of the bridge railing bites through your glove as you grip it, feeling the vibration of cart wheels and the slow passage of a ferryman poling his boat upstream, his silhouette dissolving into the river fog. Around you, merchants are already moving, their cloaks dark with moisture, their breath visible in the damp air that carries the smell of wet thatch and wood smoke from houses clustered along the bank. You are standing now at the harbour at dawn, where the river trade that sustains this city of roughly 25,000 inhabitants begins its daily rhythm. The Seine connects Paris to the English Channel, and the river has historically been important to the city's economy. Barges laden with wine from the hillsides upstream nudge against the pilings, while smaller craft bring salt fish from the sea, their cargo already attracting the attention of women from the market near the Petit Pont. The linguistic boundary between the Langue d'Oil and the Langue d'Oc lies somewhere to the south, but here in Paris, the northern dialect fills the morning, the voices of labourers and watermen rising and falling with the motion of the boats. The old Gallo-Roman wall, built centuries earlier, still partially encloses the city, but is crumbling in places where mortar has surrendered to frost and root. And through one of these gaps, you can see the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés lying outside the walls on the left bank, its bells beginning their morning sequence, the sound drifting across the river fog to reach your ears. The Grand Rue stretches before you as you turn inland, unpaved and already becoming a quagmire in the wet weather, the sucking sound accompanying every step you take. The Roman road network is said to still determine the main axes of the city's street plan, and one can reportedly trace the old line of the Via di Cumana beneath the chaos of wooden stalls and overhanging upper stories. The population includes the crowded Isle de la Cité and the expanding settlements on both banks of the Seine, though the true density of life remains on the island where the royal palace occupies the western end. There where the Palais de Justice stands today, and where the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris is under construction, its towers already visible above the jagged roofline. A young man on horseback approaches through the mist, his escort clattering on planks where the mud has been covered with straw. This is Philip Augustus, 15 years old, entering the city before his journey to Rheims for coronation, observing the narrow wooden houses and the rising cathedral with the particular attention of one who will spend much of his reign transforming what he sees. In 1180, Paris was a royal residence of the Capetian dynasty, but not yet the undisputed capital of France, and the young king may have known that Paris was one of several important cities in the Ile-de-France, competing with Orléans and Tours for wealth and influence. The merchant class is growing, but still politically subordinate to the nobility and clergy, a fact visible in the deferential gestures of the market crowd as the royal party passes, in the way the ferryman removes his cap, and the woman haggling over salt fish lets her voice fall silent. You follow the royal procession at a distance, your feet finding firmer ground where old Roman pavement occasionally surfaces through the muck. The grey light of November afternoons extinguishes early here, compressed between tall narrow houses whose upper stories almost meet overhead, and already you sense the day withdrawing even as the morning begins. The taste of rye bread, slightly mouldy from damp storage, lingers from your morning meal, a common experience in a city where grain must be stored through the long, wet season against the threat of scarcity. Around you, merchants are unloading cargoes of pottery and wool, their movements deliberate in the cold, their hands wrapped in strips of linen against the roughness of rope and crate. The market near the Petit Pont fills with the particular commerce of a river city, salt fish laid out on boards under leather awnings that drip with condensed moisture. The woman haggling over price has returned to her negotiation now that the king has passed, her voice rising again in the pattern of offer and refusal that will continue until one party concedes or walks away. In the market, merchant power is felt in the weight of silver and the movement of goods, in decisions that determine whether a family eats fish or goes hungry through the winter months. Hours have passed since you stood at the harbour at dawn, time measured here by the angle of grey light rather than any precise instrument. The Rue Saint-Denis runs north from the market, equally unpaved, equally treacherous, its surface churned by carts bringing stone and timber for the ongoing construction that marks this as a city in transition. The old Gallo-Roman wall still partially encloses the city, but is crumbling, and you can see where new growth has already spilled beyond its protection, the risk of fire and raid, accepted in exchange for space to build and breathe. The connection to the English Channel is visible in the faces of sailors who move through the crowd, their speech carrying the accent of Normandy or Picardy, their clothing stiff with salt that has not yet been washed away by the rain. Philip Augustus has paused at the entrance to the royal palace, dismounting to receive the blessing of a priest who has emerged from the cathedral works. The young king observes the narrow wooden houses with an expression that you cannot read at this distance, but you know that his reign will see the widening of streets, the paving of roads, the construction of walls that will not crumble. For now, however, the city remains as it is, a collection of timber and thatch clustered on an island and spilling onto both banks, dependent on the river that surrounds it, subject to the mud and the damp and the grey light that extinguishes early by low clouds. The cold air moves across your face as you turn westward, away from the market, following the line of the island's edge where the river flows fastest. The Petit Pont and Grand Pont connect the Isle de la Cité to the left and right banks, and from the midpoint of the smaller bridge you can see both connections, both lines of traffic moving in the slow rhythm of a city that has not yet learned to hurry. You sense the density of 25,000 inhabitants in the press of bodies at the bridge's terminus, in the waiting boats, in voices that call across the water for passage or for goods. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, burial place of French kings, lies some 7 kilometers to the north, probably too distant for its bells to reach you, but its presence may be felt in the expectation of the crowd, in the knowledge that Philip Augustus could ride there before continuing to Rheims for his coronation ceremony. The bells of Saint-Germain-des-Prés drift across the river fog with a sound that seems to come from nowhere, from the grey itself, marking the hours of monastic prayer while the secular city continues its commerce. You find shelter in a doorway as the rain intensifies, watching water run in streams from thatched roofs of the Grand Rue, turning the street to ankle-deep mud where drainage has failed. The smell of wet thatch and wood smoke mingles with the rot of autumn leaves, a compound of decay and comfort that defines this season, this place. The sucking sound of boots in mud provides a bass note to the higher sounds of commerce and conversation, the whole forming a texture that you feel in your body rather than hear with any precision. Beneath the chaos of present use, you can sense the old order, the straight line that once connected this place to the wider empire, now buried but not erased. In a house on the right bank, a scribe writes by tallow light, the parchment smelling of lime and sheep fat, his pen moving in the constrained gestures of a craft that preserves what memory cannot hold. You do not enter this house, but you know it is there, know that somewhere in the growing darkness men are recording the events of this day, the entry of the young king, the price of fish, the state of the weather, facts that will become history only when someone reads them later, in another light, with another purpose. In the scriptorium, a different power is exercised, the power of inscription, of making permanent what would otherwise pass with the moment. The cold iron of the Petit Pont railing waits for your palm again as you recross toward the island, the day's business drawing you back to the center. The Seine below has risen further, its color still indistinguishable from the sky, the ferryman still poling his boat in the middle distance, his progress barely perceptible against the current. The unfinished Cathedral of Notre-Dame rises at the eastern end of the island, and you move toward it now, drawn by the sound of vespers beginning, the voices of cannons rising in the confined space of a building that will itself be transformed, rebuilt, made into the monument that later ages will know. For now it is sufficient, a presence that marks the eastern end of the island as the royal palace marks the western, the sacred and the secular in balance as they have been and will be. The city expands onto both banks of the Seine, but the island remains the heart, the place where power concentrates and where, in time, power will be challenged. The rain has softened to a drizzle that you barely feel, so complete is your saturation, so accustomed has your skin become to moisture. The grey light has reached that point of diffusion where shadows disappear, where the distinction between stone and wood, between river and sky, becomes merely a matter of texture rather than tone. The distant bells of Saint-Germain-des-Prés drift across the river fog again, marking some office that you do not know, their sound arriving with a delay that makes them seem to belong to another time entirely, a time before this king, before this rain, before the mud that sucks at your boots with each step. At dusk, the watchman calls the hour from the tower, his voice carrying across the dark water with a clarity that surprises you, as if the evening has stripped away the interference of day, has made a channel for sound that did not exist before. You are standing at the harbor at dawn no longer, though some part of you remains there. Some part of any day persists in the body even as time moves on. You imagine the tide of darkness moving upriver, the same darkness that has already reached the sea now making its slow way toward you, bringing with it the cold that will deepen through the night. The old Roman wall, where it still stands, provides shelter for the night watch against the November wind, and you see them now, two men in leather cloaks, their faces indistinguishable in the failing light, their bodies pressed against stone that others laid centuries before. In its decay, the wall offers this one service still, this break against the wind that comes down the river valley with nothing to stop it, until the hills rise to the north and east. The watchmen do not speak to you, perhaps do not see you, absorbed in their own discomfort, their own vigilance against a night that holds threats they have learned to expect but never to name. The taste of rye bread returns to you as hunger makes itself felt, the morning meal long dissolved into the labor of walking, of standing, of attending to a city that does not pause for any single hunger. This uncertainty of status is felt in the watchfulness of the night guard, in the way the city does not quite rest, does not quite trust the darkness to pass without event. Somewhere among 25,000 inhabitants, fires are being banked, children settled, prayers spoken in the dialect of the north, the langue d'oil that will spread with the city's eventual dominance, that will become the language of a nation not yet born. You move along the wall, your hand finding cold iron of a staple where once a gate hung, where once the legions passed in ordered columns. Even in darkness, you can feel the Roman order beneath present chaos, the straight line asserting itself against the curve of convenience. The knowledge of muddy streets is in your muscles now, in the ache of calves that have lifted and lifted again against the suction of unpaved ground. The Abbey of St. Denis waits 7 kilometers to the north, and in the morning, Philip Augustus will ride toward it, will leave this muddy city for the cleaner air of the monastery, the more certain ground of sacred precedent. For now, he is in the royal palace that occupies the western end of the Isle de la Cité, where the Palais de Justice stands today, preparing for departure or perhaps already sleeping the sleep of the young, untroubled by the weight that waits upon his crown. You do not enter there, do not approach that threshold, but you know the building is there, know that power concentrates even in darkness, especially in darkness. The sucking sound of boots in mud has diminished, only a few travelers still abroad, their business urgent or their circumstances desperate enough to risk the night. From the dark mass of the Petit Pont you hear a voice, a ferryman perhaps, poling his last crossing, or a watchman calling a challenge that receives no answer. The cold air moves across your face with a gentleness that suggests the wind is dropping, the storm passing, the night settling into that stillness that comes before the deepest hours. The Seine below you reflects nothing, absorbs all light, moves with a sound that is less heard than felt through the planks of the bridge, through the soles of your boots, through the bones of your legs. The city of Paris in 1180, residence of kings, but not yet capital, home to 25,000 souls, clings to its island and its riverbanks with the tenacity of any settlement that has survived the centuries of its making. The mud receives the rain. The thatch drips. The watchman makes his rounds along the old wall that still stands, that still provides shelter against the wind, and his footsteps fade into the larger silence of a city that is not sleeping, but has entered that state between waking and sleep, where movement continues without purpose, where the day lingers in the body even as the mind releases it. You are standing on the Petit Pont. The cold iron of the railing has warmed slightly where your hand rests, or your hand has cooled to match it, the distinction no longer mattering. The river below moves in darkness. The sky above offers no stars. Somewhere to the north, 7 kilometers distant, the Abbey of St. Denis holds the dead kings in their stone sleep, and somewhere to the west, the young Philip Augustus lies in the palace that will be transformed, that will become the Palais de Justice of a later age. The unfinished cathedral rises at the eastern end of the island, its tower where the watchman called now silent, its stones cooling in the November air. The rain has stopped. The fog remains, thicker now, a presence that touches your face with fingers of moisture, that enters your clothing, that makes every surface soft, indistinct, forgiving. The Grand Rue stretches away from the bridge in darkness, its mud invisible, its unevenness felt only in the ankles, in the small adjustments of balance that walking requires. The Rue St. Denis runs north in equal darkness, equal softness, the two main axes of the Roman plan still determining movement even when they cannot be seen. You do not move. The ferryman has reached his landing, has secured his boat, has gone to his own rest. The woman who haggled over salt fish has counted her coins, has eaten or not eaten according to their number, has lain down in whatever space her life provides. The scribe on the right bank has covered his parchment, has blown out his tallow light, the smell of lime and sheep fat lingering in the room where he sleeps. The old Gallo-Roman wall receives the wind where it still stands, and the watchmen press against it, and their breathing becomes regular, slower, approaching the rhythm of the stones they guard. The Seine connects Paris to the English Channel. This fact remains, will remain, when other facts have been transformed or forgotten. The river moves in darkness, carrying the rain of this day toward the sea, carrying the mud that has washed from the streets, the debris of a city's life, all of it moving in the darkness with a sound that is not quite silence, not quite music, but something between, something that continues as you stand on the bridge, as your hand rests on the railing, as your breath mingles with the fog. The taste of rye bread has faded from your mouth. The smell of wet thatch and wood smoke has faded from the air, or your senses have accommodated, have ceased to register what persists. The distant bells of Saint-Germain-des-Prés have fallen silent, their office complete, their sound replaced by the larger silence that contains the river, the fog, the city of 25,000 inhabitants gathered on their island and their banks, waiting for morning, waiting for the young king's departure, waiting for the slow transformation that this year, this reign, this century will bring. The cold air moves across your face once more, a final current before the night's stillness completes itself. The mud holds your boots as you shift your weight, then releases them with the soft sound of suction, of separation, of something ending. The old wall stands. The river flows. The fog receives all things into itself, making them soft, making them present without demanding attention, without requiring the effort of distinction, of naming, of knowing. You remain on the bridge. The night deepens. The city of Paris in 1180 holds you in its darkness, its mud, its smoke, its river sound, and you let yourself be held. Let the weight of the day dissolve into the larger weight of time, of place, of a moment that will pass and will remain, recorded in parchment smelling of lime and sheep fat, in the memory of stone and water, in the slow accumulation of mornings and evenings that makes a life, a city, a history that later hands will read by other lights, in other rooms, with other purposes. The first stones arrive on the Grand Rue in the spring of 1181, hauled by ox cart from the quarries south of the city, and you are standing at the edge of the Isle de la Cité as the animals pass, their hooves sinking slightly into the mud of the approach road, their breath rising in pale clouds against the cold morning air. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of cloth and grain and salted fish, stepping aside to let the heavy carts through, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular dampness of a March dawn beside the Seine. The limestone blocks sit pale and rough-edged in their wooden beds, each one the size of a man's torso, each one destined to become part of a surface that will outlast the men who move it, the carts that carry it, the very language being spoken around it in the market stalls. You watch a laborer climb onto the cart and test the weight of a single block with his shoulder, his tunic dark with the grey dust of masonry work that has already begun to coat the hands and faces of all who work this trade. The sound of the city in 1181 is still largely the sound of mud, of wooden wheels sinking and pulling free with a soft, reluctant sucking, of footsteps that disappear into the yielding surface rather than announcing themselves, and you feel this uncertainty under your own feet as you move through the crowd toward the place where the masons have begun their preparation. The Grand Rue runs east-west across the Isle de la Cité, the city's main commercial artery, and for generations it has carried the weight of commerce through seasons of thaw and freeze and thaw again, its surface churned by countless hooves and wheels and feet into a consistency that varies from thick liquid to treacherous crust. Now Philip II Augustus, early in his reign, has ordered the paving of this street and of the Rue Saint-Denis that extends north from the Grand Pont toward the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and the work that follows will alter how the city sounds, how it smells, how it moves through the hours of its daily life. A mason kneels at the edge of the prepared trench, the first course of his craft laid bare to the morning light, and you stand close enough to observe the method of his testing, the way he sets a limestone block into its waiting bed and pauses before committing his work. His iron hammer rises and falls with a deliberate rhythm, striking the stone to feel for the resonance that will tell him whether the fit is true, whether the surface will settle evenly into its neighbors or will shift in the first season of frost and undo his labor. The ring of the mason's hammer echoes between close timber walls, the upper stories of houses projecting outward to meet across the way, and the sound carries a quality you have not heard before in these streets, a note of permanence, of deliberate construction that separates itself from the accidental noises of commerce and conversation. The grey dust of masonry work coats his hands as he works, whitening the creases of his knuckles, and when he wipes his forehead with the back of his wrist, he leaves a pale streak across his skin that marks him as a man engaged in changing the substance of the city. The paving stones come from local limestone deposits, some from the underground mines that would later become the catacombs, and you imagine the darkness of those extraction places, the pickmen working by lamplight in passages that will one day hold the bones of millions, though no one now suspects this future. The blocks travel by cart and barge and cart again, accumulating the marks of their journey, the small chips and abrasions that will not matter once they are set into their final positions, their upper surfaces dressed smooth by other masons with other hammers. Drainage channels run alongside or beneath the paved surfaces, a concession to the reality that water will always find its way, that the Seine rises and falls, and the rain falls regardless of royal ambition. And you notice how the foreman gestures toward these channels with his measuring rod, indicating the slope that will carry water away from the finished street. The work required coordination between the Crown, the Bishop of Paris, and the city's emerging municipality, three powers whose interests do not naturally align, whose negotiations must have occupied the winter months while the ground lay frozen and unworkable. The cost was borne partly by the Crown and partly by taxes on the city's inhabitants, and you sense this distribution in the faces of those who watch the work, some with the satisfaction of investment, others with the resentment of those who see their labor converted to another's monument. Street paving was a visible symbol of royal authority and urban improvement, and Philip II Augustus understood this visibility, the way a king's power could be read in the surfaces his subjects walked upon, in the sound their carts made as they moved through the governed space. The work employed local laborers under royal overseers, men who would return to their other trades once the paving was complete, who would tell their sons and grandsons that they had set the first stones of the new Paris, that they had felt the cool evenness of the paved surface underfoot when it was still a promise rather than a memory. By the summer of 1183, the Grand Rue has begun to assert its new character in sections, the pale limestone catching the high sun and throwing back a heat that the old mud surface never possessed. And you walk these partial streets in the late afternoon, feeling through your thin soles the difference between finished and unfinished, between the settled blocks and the remaining patches of exposed earth. The scrape of iron-shod cartwheels on fresh limestone paving announces the passage of a wine merchant's vehicle, the sound sharp and carrying, no longer absorbed by the yielding ground, and you notice how the carter adjusts his pace, how the animal between the shafts seems to find a more certain footing, how the whole transaction of movement has been altered by the change beneath it. The paved surface, in summer heat, radiates warmth long after sunset, and you stand in the evening with your palm hovering above the stone, feeling the stored day release itself slowly into the cooling air, a new rhythm of temperature that belongs to this new materiality. The Rue Saint-Denis extends north from the Grand Pont toward the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and its paving proceeds more slowly, the distance greater, the coordination with the Abbey's own properties more complex, and you follow its progress through the months, noting where the stones end and the old surface resumes, where the transition must be managed with planks or with a sudden step down into the familiar uncertainty. A merchant's cart, for the first time, passes the length of the Rue Saint-Denis without becoming stuck, and you hear the story passed from mouth to mouth in the taverns that evening, the wonder of it, the sense that something fundamental has shifted in the city's possibilities. The paved streets facilitated the movement of goods and people, accelerating commerce, and you observe this acceleration in the increased frequency of carts at the gates, in the merchants' calculations of journey time, in the slow expansion of trade that depends upon reliable passage. The old women who had sold wooden clogs at the street corners find their trade diminished, and you see one of them on a September morning, her small stock arranged on a cloth before her, watching the feet that pass in leather and felt and bare skin, the wooden protection no longer quite so necessary now that the worst of the mud has been conquered. She does not complain aloud, this woman whose name you will never know, whose face belongs to the anonymous life of the city, but her stillness speaks a recognition that progress carries its casualties, that improvement for most means diminishment for some. The project was part of Philip's broader program of asserting royal control over Paris, and you understand this assertion not as a single dramatic gesture, but as this accumulation of surfaces, of sounds, of changed habits that gradually make a new city out of the old. At night, the sound of cartwheels changes from the soft squelch of mud to the hard clatter of stone, and you lie awake in a chamber overlooking the Grand Rue, listening to this new nocturnal music, each vehicle distinct in its passage, its direction readable in the Doppler shift of its approach and recession. The changed quality of footsteps at night, now sharp and definite instead of muffled, reaches you through the shuttered window, the watchman's boots, the late reveler's unsteady gait, the cat's light patter, each given a clarity that the old surface denied. You are standing at the river's edge at dawn, the place where the stone arrives by water, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular freshness of a morning when work is beginning again, when the project continues its slow extension through the city's body. The year 1185 arrives with the paving completed, ending generations of mud in the city's principal streets, and you walk the full length of the Grand Rue on a morning in late March, feeling the completeness of it, the way the individual blocks have become a continuous surface, their joints filled with finer material, their collective presence asserting a new order upon the ancient route. Rain falls on the new paving in 1185, running in sheets between the stones instead of pooling in mud, and you stand in a doorway watching this drainage, the water finding its designed channels, the surface remaining passable even in the downpour that would once have halted all movement. The smell of wet stone after rain, mineral and clean, replaces the old odor of wet earth, of churned refuse, of the organic decomposition that the mud perpetually concealed and revealed, and you breathe this new air with a sense that the city has been washed not only of its dirt, but of something older, something that belonged to a different order of existence. Chronicle sources note the paving as a significant event in the city's transformation, and you imagine the clerks in their scriptoriums, the quills moving across parchment, the phrases of Latin that will preserve this fact for later readers, for later listeners, for those who will stand where you stand and try to recover the sensory reality behind the recorded abstraction. The paving of the Grand Rue established a precedent for subsequent urban improvements, and you see this establishment in the minds of the administrators who walk the finished street with their measuring rods and their accounts, calculating what has been spent, what has been gained, what might next be attempted. The streets remained narrow, with upper stories of houses projecting outward to meet across the way, and you feel this narrowness as a kind of embrace, the built environment holding the life of the city close, the new stone surface a floor for this enclosing architecture. A merchant passes with his cart loaded with Flemish cloth, the wheels making their decisive sound upon the stone, and you step back to let him through, feeling the cool evenness of the paved surface underfoot where you stand, the stability that has replaced the old negotiation with each step. The grey dust of masonry work still coats the walls and ledges near the completed sections, a reminder of the labour that produced this ease, the hands that placed each block with the care that would ensure its survival through centuries of use and weather and the slow pressure of time. The ring of the mason's hammer has moved to other streets now, other projects, and you hear it faintly from the direction of the Grand Pont, where new work begins even as the old is finished, the city perpetually remaking itself in the image of its own ambition. You walk the Rue Saint-Denis toward the Abbey in the afternoon of a clear day, the limestone pale and warm beneath your feet, the sound of your own footsteps, part of this new acoustic world, sharp and definite where they would once have been muffled by the yielding ground. The Abbey of Saint-Denis rises before you, its own stone surfaces older than this street, its own history of construction and reconstruction, and you feel the conversation between these surfaces, the paved way and the sacred building, the secular power and the spiritual, the temporal and the eternal, all of it held in the material fact of limestone shaped and placed and walked upon. The scrape of iron-shod cartwheels on fresh limestone paving reaches you from behind, a cart making its way toward the market, and you do not turn, but let the sound pass through you, carrying its information of commerce and movement and the ordinary life that continues regardless of who reigns, who records, who remembers. The evening settles over the paved streets with a particular quality of reflection, the stone surfaces holding the last light longer than earth would do, releasing it gradually into the gathering darkness, and you sit on a bench near the corner where the old woman once sold her clogs, the place now occupied by a seller of roasted nuts, whose trade depends upon the increased foot traffic that the paving has encouraged. The warmth stored in the stone reaches you through the wood of the bench, through the fabric of your garments, a new phenomenon of urban life that belongs to this material world. The sound of the city at night has been altered, and you listen to this alteration as you might listen to music, attending to its variations, its themes, its development through the hours of darkness. The Seine moves at the edges of your awareness, its sound continuous beneath the new sounds of the street, and you let yourself be held by this continuity, the river that predates all paving, all improvement, all assertion of royal will upon the city's form. The work that Philip, the second Augustus, ordered early in his reign has become part of what you walk upon, what you hear, what you smell when the rain falls and the mineral clean of wet stone rises to meet your senses. You bear the cost, still in the unthinking ease of your passage, the freedom from mud that your steps take for granted, the stability that has become as invisible as the old uncertainty once was. The paving stones were quarried from local limestone deposits, some from the underground mines that would later become the catacombs, and you move above these depths with each step, above the darkness where the stone was born, above the future darkness where it will eventually crumble and be replaced by other surfaces, other sounds, other habits of movement through the city's changing body. The drainage channels run alongside or beneath the paved surfaces, invisible now but present, carrying away the water that falls, maintaining the passage that the paving makes possible, and you trust to this hidden labor as you trust to the visible, the surface and the depth together making the street what it is. The work employed local laborers under royal overseers, and these men have returned to their homes, their hands still bearing perhaps the calluses of their labor, their memories still holding the particular weight of the blocks they moved, the particular sound of the hammer they swung or heard swung nearby. The coordination between the Crown, the Bishop of Paris, and the city's emerging municipality has become part of the city's structure, invisible as the drainage channels, necessary as the stone itself. The Grand Rue ran east-west across the Isle de la Cité, the city's main commercial artery, and you walk its length now in the darkness before true night, feeling its direction, its purpose, its accumulated history of feet and wheels and hooves upon its surface. The Rue Saint-Denis extended north from the Grand Pont toward the Abbey of Saint-Denis, and you have walked it too, have felt its own particular character, its own contribution to the network of paved ways that now binds the city together. The first stones laid on the Grand Rue in 1181, hauled by ox cart from the quarries south of the city, have become part of a surface that will outlast the memory of their laying, that will carry generations of feet beyond counting, that will wear and be repaired and wear again, until the very concept of a paved street becomes as natural as the concept of a muddy one once was. You are standing at the edge of this history, in the darkness of a city that holds you in its new sounds, its new smells, its new certainties of passage, and you let yourself be held. Let the weight of the day dissolve into the larger weight of time, a place, of a moment that will pass and will remain, recorded in parchment smelling of lime and sheep fat, in the memory of stone and water, in the slow accumulation of footsteps that makes a life, a city, a history that later hands will walk upon by other lights, in other streets, with other purposes. The first light of a March morning in 1180 moves across the Seine, and you are standing at the water's edge, where the island's eastern shore meets the working harbor of the Isle de la Cité. Around you, the cold air carries the smell of freshly quarried limestone, sharp and chalky, mingling with the dust of carving that has begun to rise from the cathedral site above. The river's surface holds a pale sheen, neither silver nor gold, but something between the two, something that belongs to this hour alone. You feel the cold of the unheated morning, even as the season turns, rising through the worn leather of your shoes from the damp ground. The particular resonance of hammers and chisels already drifts downward from the choir, where stoneworkers prepare the high vaults, 17 years of labor now reaching toward completion. Bishop Maurice de Sully, now elderly, will soon make his way through the scaffolding to inspect the progress of the work he began in 1163, when the first stones were laid and the first trenches cut into ground that had held older prayers. Construction of Notre-Dame de Paris began in 1163 under Bishop Maurice de Sully, and now, in 1180, the choir and eastern parts are substantially complete. The building stretches 130 meters long, 48 meters wide, and will rise to 35 meters high in the nave when the vaulting is finished. You walk up from the river through streets still narrow, still crowded with the wooden houses of artisans and the small gardens of canons, past the old walls that once ringed a smaller island, toward the rising mass of stone that has transformed the eastern end of the island, previously occupied by the older Saint Etienne. The cathedral's construction required enormous quantities of stone, timber, iron, and labor, and the evidence of this requirement surrounds you in every cart and shouting teamster. The Bishop of Paris held authority over the Isle de la Cité, competing with royal jurisdiction at the palace's western end, and this tension between sacred and secular power has shaped every decision about the building's scale, its orientation, its claim upon the sky. The main axis deviates approximately 30 degrees from true east, aligned with the Seine's right arm, so that the cathedral faces the rising sun as it appears above the river's curve, a practical theology written in geometry. The quality of light through the temporary west wall, canvas or rough planking, diffuses and pales as you enter the construction site, and the interior opens around you like a forest of stone, like the notion of a forest made vertical and permanent. The coarse texture of unfinished stone blocks still bears the marks of the quarry, each chisel stroke a record of human effort, of arms lifting, of eyes judging the angle of approach. You place your palm against one such block and feel the irregular ridges, the slight warmth where morning sun has touched the outer face, the deeper chill where shadow persists. The taste of dust on your lips will come later, but already the air is thick with it, a fine powder that settles on brows and sleeves, that turns sweat into pale mud. The changing light through the unfinished clerestory sends temporary wooden shutters casting striped shadows across the floor, bars of darkness and pale gold that shift almost imperceptibly as the sun climbs. Notre-Dame was among the earliest Gothic churches in France, employing rib vaults and flying buttresses, and you can see the skeletal logic of this system emerging above you, the stone ribs like the vault of a vast rib cage, like the architecture of breath itself. A master mason argues with a timber merchant near the northern transept, their voices low, but carrying in the particular resonance of a vaulted space, not yet softened by hangings or human habitation. The merchant has brought oak from the forests to the southeast, and the master mason finds fault with the grain, with the seasoning, with the weight of the beams that must span the roof framework. You observe from a distance, not wishing to intrude upon negotiations that will determine whether the vaulting above can be closed against weather before the autumn rains. The argument circles the same points: the price per load, the months of drying, the risk of warping in a building that must stand for centuries. The master mason gestures toward the choir, toward the work that Bishop Maurice de Sully set in motion, toward the standard that must be maintained. The merchant counters with the difficulty of transport, with the royal tolls exacted at river crossings, with the competition from other sites where timber is equally scarce. Their words echo and overlap in the stone vastness, imperfectly absorbed by bare walls that return sound with a slight delay, a second presence, a ghost of each utterance. The cold of the interior, even as morning advances, rises from the stone floor through thin leather soles, and you understand how this space will feel in winter, how the canons will wrap themselves in furs, how the candles will gutter in draughts that find every opening. Yet there is something in this chill that belongs to the purpose of the place, a reminder that stone outlasts warmth, that the building serves durations beyond individual comfort. You move toward the eastern end, where the high altar will stand, where the choir stalls are still rough planks, where the first Mass celebrated in the completed choir in 1182 will mark a threshold between construction and consecration. For now, in 1180, the space is still raw with plaster dust and new lime, the whiteness of fresh application gleaming where torchlight touches it, the smell sharp enough to catch in the throat. The interior could accommodate up to 10,000 people, though today it holds perhaps 50 workers, their tools, their materials, the accumulated debris of years of labor. The two western towers will stand 69 meters high when completed around 1245, but from where you stand in the eastern choir, the western end is still open to the sky, still a frame of timber and hope. Dust motes hang in the light, each visible, each slow in its drifting, as if time itself has thickened in this space between earth and the vaulting above. The smell of freshly quarried limestone mingles here with the greener scent of wet mortar, with the smoke of the small fires used to warm the lime, with the human presence of men who have worked since before dawn. You find a place to sit on a low pile of cut stone, feeling the cold of the unheated interior even in this early hour, and you watch the play of the changing light, the striped shadows that have moved several degrees since you entered. The particular resonance of chant in a vaulted space, not yet softened by hangings or human habitation, will come later, at Vespers. But already the acoustic properties of the building assert themselves in every dropped tool, every called instruction, every footfall on stone. The taste of dust on your lips is becoming familiar now, a mineral presence that water does not fully clear, that belongs to this place as the smell belongs to it, as the cold belongs to it. Bishop Maurice de Sully arrives as the morning advances, his step slower than it was 17 years past, his bearing still upright in the black habit of his order. He moves through the site with the familiarity of one who has watched every stage, who can read the progress in what others might see only as confusion of timber and rope and half-carved stone. You stand aside as he passes, close enough to observe the lines of his face, the patience in his examination of a newly set vault stone, the slight nod that indicates satisfaction or the slight pause that indicates doubt. In 1163, he was younger, newly bishop, ambitious for his see, and for the glory of the God he served in a city that was learning to think of itself as capital. Now, in 1180, his inspection has the quality of a man seeing the middle of a story whose end he may not live to witness. The cathedral was dedicated in 1182, though construction continued for decades, and this knowledge hangs in the air between his presence and the unfinished western end, between what has been achieved and what remains to be imagined. The coarse texture of unfinished stone blocks draws your fingers again as you walk the perimeter of the choir, each block a geography of extraction, of the tools that freed it, of the hands that loaded it, of the river that brought it. You think of the distances compressed in this material, the quarries to the south, the forests to the east, the forges where iron was worked for tools and for the clamps that hold stone to stone. The network of supply extends far beyond this island, far beyond this city, into the economic life of a region that is slowly, through projects such as this, becoming a kingdom. The competition between episcopal and royal authority has its material expression in the scale of the building, in its claim to dominate the skyline, to be visible from every approach, to mark the eastern end of the island as sacred ground. At noon, the workers pause, and the particular resonance of hammers and chisels gives way to a different quality of sound. Voices in conversation, the clatter of wooden bowls, the soft percussion of bodies finding rest. You move to the western end, where the facade will rise, where the two western towers will stand 69 meters high when completed around 1245. For now, in 1180, the view opens to the sky, to the distant roofs of the palace, to the smoke of the city's 1,000 fires. The quality of light through the temporary west wall is strongest here, a pale diffusion that makes every figure into something half seen, half imagined. The smell of freshly quarried limestone lingers, but now it mingles with the smoke of cooking fires, with the sharper scent of onion and salt pork, with the human moment of a working day suspended. The cold of the unheated interior, even at midday, rises from the stone floor, and you feel the permanence of this chill, how it will outlast every worker, every bishop, every king who walks these stones. The taste of dust on your lips is now accompanied by hunger, by the desire for the simple meal you have brought, bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. You find a corner where the changing light, the striped shadows, creates a small island of relative warmth, and you eat slowly, watching the life of the site continue around you. The master mason has resolved his argument with the timber merchant, or perhaps postponed it, for they sit together now on a pile of rope, sharing a flask, their earlier conflict set aside in the fellowship of shared labor. Bishop Maurice de Sully has departed, his inspection complete, his presence lingering only in the slightly increased attention of the workers, in the care with which they return to their tasks. The interior could accommodate up to 10,000 people, and you try to imagine this space filled. Try to hear the particular resonance of chant multiplied by hundreds of voices, by the shuffle of thousands of feet, by the breathing of a crowd. The afternoon brings a shift in the weather, a softening of the light, a moisture in the air that promises rain by evening. The coarse texture of unfinished stone blocks seems to darken with this change, now holding the humidity, releasing the deeper smell of wet earth and ancient sediment. You walk the length of the nave, from the raw eastern choir toward the open western end, counting your paces, feeling the scale of the building in the duration of this walk. The proportions translate into time as you move, into the rhythm of your own breathing, into the gradual awareness of how small a single body becomes in such a space. The cathedral's construction transformed the eastern end of the island, previously occupied by the older Saint Etienne, and you sense the layers here, the older foundations that were cleared to make way, the accumulated prayers of centuries that do not simply vanish but persist in the ground, in the memory of place, in the continuity of sacred function, even as the form changes utterly. The great rose windows, added in the 13th century, will become masterpieces of medieval glass. But for now, the clerestory openings are empty or covered with temporary protection, and the light enters without mediation, without the jewel tones that will later transform the interior into something closer to the imagined courts of heaven. The striped shadows have shifted to the north side of the nave as the sun descends, and the temperature drops perceptibly, the cold of the unheated interior asserting itself against the brief warmth of afternoon. You watch a young apprentice carrying water to the masons, his step careful on the uneven floor, his eyes lifted to the vaulting above as if he cannot help but measure himself against what his elders have built. This boy was not yet born when the first stones were laid, may not live to see the western facade completed, yet he carries his portion of the work with a seriousness that needs no explanation, that belongs to the nature of participation in something larger than individual lifespan. The quality of light through the temporary west wall softens toward evening, losing its edge, becoming more purely atmospheric, more purely the light of a particular hour that will not repeat exactly, that belongs to this day alone among all the days of construction. The taste of dust on your lips has become something you no longer notice consciously, a condition of presence here, like the cold, like the smell of freshly quarried limestone mingling with the dust of carving that now seems to permeate every surface, every fold of cloth, every strand of hair. You find yourself near the southern portal, where sculptural programs on the portals conveyed biblical narratives to a largely illiterate population, and you observe the carvers at work on the figures of the Last Judgment, their chisels precise, their mallets controlled, the stone yielding under pressure to reveal what they have imagined and drawn, and now must make visible to those who will pass this way. Pilgrims gathering at the portal to touch the stone figures still being carved will come in greater numbers as the work progresses, as the word spreads that something new rises on the island, something that offers access to the sacred through the senses, through the body, through the simple act of contact with stone that has been shaped to tell a story. At Vespers, the chant of cannons echoes in the vast space, imperfectly absorbed by bare stone walls, and you are present for this first true filling of the building with its intended sound. The voices rise from the choir, where Bishop Maurice de Sully, now elderly, has returned for this office, where the first Mass celebrated in the completed choir in 1182 will mark a fuller consecration, but where already, in 1180, the essential function is being performed. The cold of the unheated interior, even in summer, rises from the stone floor, but you stand with others, craftsmen and clerks, and the curious, all drawn by the novelty of hearing this space used for its purpose. The changing light has given way to the weaker light of evening, to the first torches, to the flicker of flame that makes the vaulting move and shift as if alive. The particular resonance of chant is clearer now, more present, each phrase hanging slightly longer than it would in a smaller space, in a furnished space, in a space that has learned to absorb rather than return. You close your eyes and let the sound locate you. Let it tell you where you stand in relation to the singers, to the walls, to the distant open end where night is entering. The smell of freshly quarried limestone now mingles too with the smoke of torches, with the slight sweetness of burning resin, with the intensification of human presence in a space that has been largely empty. The interior could accommodate up to 10,000 people, but tonight it holds perhaps 30 cannons and twice that number of onlookers, and the sound does not fill the space so much as inhabit it, does not compete with the stone so much as partner with it in a collaboration that will continue for centuries. The wooden spire above the crossing, later destroyed and reconstructed, rose to 93 meters, but for now there is no spire, only the crossing itself marked by temporary roofing, by the 4 great piers that will eventually support that vanished height. You look upward and see the stars through gaps in the covering, see the sky that the builders have not yet claimed, the last openness that will be closed when the work is complete, when the building becomes fully itself, fully stone, fully the assertion of human intention against time and weather and the forgetting that comes with generations. The coarse texture of unfinished stone blocks seems to participate in this Vespers, to receive the sound differently than finished surface would, to hold it in its irregularities, to release it with a slight roughness that belongs to this moment of transition. You place your hand against a pier and feel the vibration of the chant passing through the structure. The building itself become instrument, become resonating body, become participant in the worship it was designed to house. The quality of light through the temporary west wall has faded to near darkness, the pale diffusion giving way to torchlight alone, to the deliberate limitation of human vision that belongs to sacred time, to the recognition that not all must be seen to be present, that faith operates partly in obscurity, in the trust that what is heard is true, that what is promised will be fulfilled. The chant ends, and the particular resonance lingers, decays gradually, each overtone finding its own path to silence. The cannons depart, their footsteps audible long after their forms have vanished into the darkness of the eastern end. You remain, with a few others, in the quality of light that is now only torchlight, only the deliberate preservation of small visibility against the larger dark. The striped shadows are now only memory, only the record of a day that has passed, that belongs to the accumulation of days that makes a construction, that makes a life, that makes the slow emergence of a building that will be called Notre-Dame, that will be called Paris, that will be called the work of hands now dust, of voices now silent, of intentions now fulfilled or failed or transformed beyond recognition. You move toward the western end, where the quality of light is weakest, where the night enters most directly, where the building is most open to what it does not yet control. The smell of freshly quarried limestone mingling with the dust of carving persists even here, even in the darkness, a constant of the place that will remain, that will become part of what later visitors sense without naming, the subliminal awareness of stone recently worked, of a building that continues to assert its newness across centuries. The coarse texture of unfinished stone blocks meets your extended hand in the darkness, and you trace the chisel marks, the slight irregularities, the evidence of human attention that will be smoothed away in later courses, in the finished surfaces that will greet the pilgrims and the worshippers, and the centuries of visitors who will come when the scaffolding is gone, when the dust has settled, when the building has become what it was intended to be. The taste of dust on your lips is now fully established, a condition of your presence, a mark of participation that requires no further action, no further proof. You think of Bishop Maurice de Sully, now elderly, returning to his palace, to his bed, to his prayers in a space that does not yet exist, that will be completed only after his death, that will carry his intention without his name, that will be known as Notre-Dame, as the work of anonymous generations, as the accumulation of individual days into something that transcends the individual, that transcends even the memory of the individual, that exists in the realm of architecture, of art, of the sacred, where names are finally less important than presence, than function, than the simple fact of having been built and of remaining, for a time, before time reclaims all buildings, all stones, all the marks that human hands have made upon the world. The particular resonance of the space, now emptied of chant, now holding only the smaller sounds of your own breathing, of your own movement, of the night outside entering through openings not yet closed, surrounds you with a different quality of attention, a different demand. The interior the user wants me to polish a sleep narration script with specific constraints. Let me analyze the input carefully and apply the required edits. Key requirements. 1. Tighten transitions between chapters. The previous chapter ended with the interior, and this one starts with of the church. This needs smoothing. 2. Smooth, clunky sentences, especially in 3,900 words. 3. Correct factual drift, wrong centuries, anachronistic terms, conflated rulers. If unsure, soften. 4. Normalize voice, calm, scholarly, British, declarative, no exclamations, no fourth wall breaks. Second person throughout, you are standing, around you. Preserve this. 5. Verify pacing. Sentences 18-30 words, alternating narrative and descriptive blocks. Break up runs of 5+ short sentences. 6. Preserve length within plus or minus 5% of input. 7. Deduplicate. Remove repeat occurrences of sentences longer than 15 words that appear more than once, verbatim or near verbatim. Keep only the first. Let me scan for duplicates first, as this is a hard requirement, looking through the text for repeated long sentences. 1. This is from previous chapter ending. 2. The University of Paris emerged in the late 12th century from the Cathedral schools of Notre-Dame. Appears twice, paragraph 3 and near end 3. By 1200, the institution had gained sufficient recognition for Philip Augustus to issue a charter of privileges. Appears twice 4. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, appears many times, at least 4-5. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, appears multiple times, at least 3-4-6. The quality of winter light in a high window, sufficient for reading only in the middle hours of the day, appears twice 7. The smell of ink and parchment in a cramped scriptorium, mixed with the breath of concentration, appears twice 8. The taste of thin wine and stale bread, the typical sustenance of a poor scholar, appears multiple times 9. The sound of Latin spoken with a dozen different accents in the narrow streets appears multiple times 10. The sound of hundreds of young men singing in the collegiate chapels drifts across the left bank, appears twice 11. The cost of living for students varied widely, from wealthy nobles to poor scholars dependent on charity, appears twice 12. The papal bull Perens Seine of 1231, issued by Gregory IX, formally established the university's autonomy, appears twice 13. The university was divided into 4 faculties: arts, theology, canon law, and medicine, appears twice 14. The university's growth transformed the left bank from a semi-rural area to a dense quarter of scholars, appears twice 15. The university's intellectual prestige made Paris the leading center of theological and philosophical study in Europe. Appears twice 16. Students came from across Europe, from England to Hungary, from Scandinavia to Italy. Appears twice 17. Teaching occurred in rented rooms, churches, and open spaces, not yet in purpose-built structures. Appears twice 18. The mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, established houses of study in Paris in the early 13th century. Appears twice 19. The scholastic method of disputation, developed in Paris, involved rigorous logical examination of theological questions. Appears twice 20. The young scholar from Yorkshire, this phrase appears constantly, but it's short. The user said, sentences longer than 15 words, so individual short phrases don't count unless they're part of longer repeated sentences. Wait, I need to be more careful. The requirement says, scan for any sentence longer than 15 words that appears more than once, verbatim or near verbatim. Remove the repeat occurrence, keeping only the first. So the first need to find exact or near exact duplicates of sentences, 15 words. Let me identify the duplicates carefully. 1. First instance paragraph 3, vs near duplicate near end. The University of Paris emerged in the late 12th century from the Cathedral schools of Notre-Dame, and you have followed one thread of its emergence through a single day, a single arrival, a single life among the thousands that have passed through this place. These are not verbatim/near verbatim. The first parts match, but the rest differs. 2. First instance, vs near end. By 1200, the institution had gained sufficient recognition for Philip Augustus to issue a charter of privileges, and these privileges have enabled the young scholar from Yorkshire to stand here, to learn here, to become something other than what his birth would have made him. These share the opening clause, but are not verbatim/near verbatim as complete sentences. 3. First instance paragraph 5, second. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, seems to exist even here, in the midst of spoken debate, as a kind of ideal toward which the disputants strive, the silence that would contain all answers, all resolutions, all the peace of completed understanding. Paragraph 12, third. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, has here given way to a different intensity, the intensity of devotion, of the direct address to the divine that underlies and justifies all the indirect approaches of scholarship. Near end. Fourth. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, seems to follow these men like an aura, the concentration of their contemplative life spilling outward into the streets they traverse. Paragraph 16. Fifth. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, comes to him only late at night, when his roommates have slept and he has hours of darkness in which to review what he has learned. The tallow candle a luxury he can afford only occasionally. Paragraph 22, sixth. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, gives way to a different silence, the silence of sleep and restoration, of bodies recovering from the demands that have been placed upon them. Paragraph 25. The core phrase, the particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, is repeated. But as complete sentences, they differ. However, the instruction says near verbatim. The repeated core is 15 words exactly. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, that's exactly 15 words. The requirement says longer than 15 words, so 15 words doesn't qualify. Or does it mean 15 plus words? If we include what follows, the sentences are longer, but the repeated portion is exactly 15 words, or slightly more depending on punctuation. I think I need to interpret longer than 15 words, strictly as 15 words. The phrase itself is exactly 15 words, but in context, these are all different sentences with the same opening clause. However, looking more carefully, I think the user means to catch things like the cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb. 14 words, not 15. Wait, let me count. The 1, cold, 2, stone, 3 of 4, a 5, church, 6, porch, 7, where 8, students, 9, stand, 10 for 11 hours, 12 of 13, disputation, 14, feet, 15, numb, 16, that's 16 words. So, the cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, is 16 words and appears multiple times with different continuations. Remove the repeat occurrence, keeping only the first. So if a sentence of 15 words appears verbatim or near verbatim more than once, remove duplicates. The tricky part is near verbatim. I think this means sentences that are identical except for minor variations. Let me look for true duplicates. Actually, looking at the text again, I see many sentences that share a common opening clause but then diverge. Are these near verbatim? The instruction is a bit ambiguous, but I think the intent is to catch exact duplicates or sentences that are almost identical. Let me look more carefully for true duplicates. The quality of winter light in a high window, sufficient for reading only in the middle hours of the day, makes such artificial illumination necessary for the morning's work. Paragraph 8, 22 words. The quality of winter light in a high window, sufficient for reading only in the middle hours of the day, falls upon the master's text in a pale rectangle that moves across the page as the hours pass, and he must shift his position to follow it, his gloved hands turning the pages with deliberate care. Paragraph 21, different ending. The quality of winter light in a high window, sufficient for reading only in the middle hours of the day, has measured your time in this quarter, has marked the boundaries of what can be known and what must remain in shadow. Near end. These share an opening 16-word clause, but are different sentences. I don't think these count as near verbatim duplicates. But wait, the cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, appears multiple times. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, awaits you now. Paragraph 10. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, gradually transfers its chill upward. Paragraph 11. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, has begun to warm slightly. Paragraph 13. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, has become the cold stone of a church interior. Very end, but these are all continuations of the same theme, not exact duplicates. Let me look for true duplicate sentences that are actually repeated almost verbatim. Actually, I think I need to re-examine. The user says the automated deduplication pass that runs after this stage catches cross-chapter repeats, but within-chapter duplicates must be fixed here. This suggests there are within-chapter duplicates that need fixing. Let me scan more carefully. Looking at the text, I don't see exact, verbatim duplicates of complete sentences. But there are many near duplicates where the same information is restated with slight variations. Wait, I need to look more carefully. Let me search for exact matches. No, looking again. Actually, in the original text, paragraph 27, at Compline, the sound of hundreds of young men singing in the collegiate chapels drifts across the left bank, and you find yourself standing in the street. Paragraph 28. The sound of hundreds of young men singing in the collegiate chapels drifts across the left bank like a kind of answer to the disorder of the daylight hours. These are near verbatim. The core sentence, the sound of hundreds of young men singing in the collegiate chapels drifts across the left bank, is repeated with different continuations. But are they the same sentence? They share a 14-word core. Let me count. The one sound, 2 of 300s, 4 of 5, young, 6 men, 7 singing, 8 in 9, the 10 collegiate, 11 chapels, 12 drifts, 13 across, 14 the 15 left, 16 bank, 17, that's 17 words before the comma. But the instruction says, sentences longer than 15 words that appears more than once. If we consider just the repeated portion, it's 17 words. But they're not complete sentences, they're clauses. I think the user is referring to actual duplicate sentences, not just repeated phrases. But looking at the text, I see that many sentences start with identical or near-identical phrases and then diverge. The instruction says near verbatim, which could mean mostly the same. Let me look at this differently. The user says the automated deduplication pass that runs after this stage catches cross-chapter repeats. This implies that the automated pass catches exact duplicates across chapters. But within a chapter, there might be sentences that are repeated with slight variations, and I need to catch those. Actually, I think I may have been overthinking this. Let me reread the text very carefully for true duplicates. After careful rereading, I believe the following are true near-verbatim duplicates that need to be addressed. 1. But since it's exactly 15 words and the requirement says longer than 15 words, this might not qualify. However, some instances have the phrase as part of a longer repeated structure. Actually, I think the safest approach is to identify any sentence that repeats essentially the same content in nearly the same words, and rephrase the duplicates rather than deleting them, since the user says edit in place for flow and accuracy only, and do not summarize, condense, or drop passages. Wait, but the deduplication instruction says remove the repeat occurrence, keeping only the first. So the first do need to remove duplicate sentences, but the first need to preserve length. This is tricky. If the first remove a sentence, I lose length. But the user says preserve length within plus or minus 5% of input. But the deduplication is a hard requirement. I think the solution is that true duplicates should be removed, and I'll need to add some content elsewhere or expand other sentences to maintain length. But actually, looking at the text, I don't see many true duplicates that are entire sentences. Let me re-examine with fresh eyes. Maybe there are exact duplicates I'm missing. Actually, wait. Let me look at this sentence. The young scholar from Yorkshire stands for a moment with his bundle pressed against his chest, his eyes moving across the unfamiliar architecture of the city, the mass of Notre-Dame visible upstream where the island rises from the water like a ship made of stone. And later, the young scholar from Yorkshire finds a place at the back of the room, his oilcloth bundle still clutched against his side, and opens his tablet with fingers that tremble slightly from cold and from the magnitude of what he has undertaken. These are different. Let me look for actual duplicates again. I think I need to take a more practical approach. The text has many sentences that start with the same 15-plus word phrase. I should treat these as near-verbatim duplicates and rephrase them so they don't repeat. But the instruction says, remove the repeat occurrence, keeping only the first. If the first literally remove them, the text will become shorter. But the user also says, do not summarize, condense, or drop passages, edit in place for flow and accuracy only, and preserve length within plus or minus 5%. I think there's a tension here. Remove the repeat occurrence, keeping only the first. I think this means, if there are actual duplicate sentences, remove the duplicates, but the first should also preserve approximate length. So perhaps I need to replace removed duplicates with new content, or expand surrounding text. But wait, looking more carefully at the text, I now see that there are sentences that repeat information almost verbatim, but are not exact duplicates. The instruction says near verbatim, which suggests I should catch these too. Let me identify all instances of repeated long phrases and handle them. 1. The full sentences are different though. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The university was divided into 4 faculties: arts, theology, canon law, and medicine, paragraphs 18 near end. 12, 13. Students came from across Europe, from England to Hungary, from Scandinavia to Italy, paragraphs 12 near end. 14. Teaching occurred in rented rooms, churches, and open spaces, not yet in purpose-built structures, paragraphs 18 near end. 15, 16, 17, 18. Okay, so many of these are essentially database entries, restated in the summary section at the end. The text seems to have a structure where it states facts, then restates them in a summarizing coda. Given the instruction to remove duplicates, I think the approach is, for the summary section at the end, I need to heavily rephrase or remove near-duplicate sentences, but the first need to preserve length, so I should replace removed content with new, non-duplicative content, actually, rereading the user's instruction again. Your previous attempt was too short. Polishing must preserve the chapter's length, target tilde 4,278 words, never below 2,139. Do not summarize, condense, or drop passages. Edit in place for flow and accuracy only. This is a key clarification. The user is saying do not drop passages. So if I remove a duplicate sentence, I need to replace it with something else that preserves the content, but in non-duplicative form. Wait, but the deduplication instruction says remove the repeat occurrence, keeping only the first. This is dropping passages, but the user says do not summarize, condense, or drop passages. I think the resolution is, the user wants me to remove verbatim/near verbatim duplicates, but not to summarize or condense non-duplicate content. So the first should replace duplicates with fresh phrasing that conveys the same information without repeating the exact sentence structure. Actually, rereading once more, do not summarize, condense, or drop passages. Edit in place for flow and accuracy only. This seems to be a general instruction, but the deduplication is a specific hard requirement. So the first must deduplicate, but I shouldn't use this as an excuse to broadly condense. I think the best approach is, when I find a duplicate sentence, I replace it with a new sentence that conveys similar information, but in different words, preserving the length and content. This satisfies both requirements. But actually, looking at the text structure, the final few paragraphs are almost entirely composed of restated sentences from earlier. This is a structural problem. The ending is a coda that repeats almost everything. Let me think about this differently. The previous attempt was too short. Comment suggests the user already had me try this once, and I made it too short. So the first need to be very careful about length. Let me count words in the input to verify the target. The user says target tilde 4,278 words. Let me do a rough count. The text looks to be around 2,000-2,500 words. Let me estimate more carefully. Actually, looking at the text, it's quite long. Let me count lines and estimate. There are about 60 paragraphs. Average 40 words each equals 2,400 words, but some are longer. Maybe 3,000-3,500 words. The user says target tilde 4,278, which suggests the original is around 4,278 words. Let me be more precise. I'll need to count during editing, but for now, let me focus on the editing task. Key tasks. 1. Fix the transition from previous chapter. Previous ended with the interior, and this starts with of the church. This needs to be seamless. 2. Fix factual issues. The year is 1205. Check if this works with other dates mentioned. Philip Augustus Charter by 1200 historical. In 1210, the Bishop of Paris condemns certain Aristotelian texts. This is future from 1205. Fine. Parens Scientiarum of 1231, future, fine. Albertus Magnus taught in Paris in the 1240s. Thomas Aquinas studied there in the same period, future from 1205, fine. Mendicant orders established houses in early 13th century. Dominicans arrived in Paris in 1217. Franciscans in 1219 to 1220. Early 13th century is a bit vague but acceptable. But wait, the text says, in the early 13th century, and already their presence makes itself felt in 1205. This is anachronistic. The Dominicans weren't founded until 1216 and arrived in Paris later. In 1205, they didn't exist yet. This is a major factual drift. I need to soften or fix this. The user says, if unsure, prefer to soften the claim rather than delete it. Actually, let me check. St. Dominic founded the Order of Preachers in 1216. The Franciscans were founded in 1209. So in 1205, neither order existed. The text says, in the early 13th century, which technically includes 1205, but already their presence makes itself felt, implies they exist in 1205, which they don't. I should soften this to something like, the mendicant orders that would soon transform Parisian learning were still gathering in these years, their founders walking the roads of southern Europe, or similar. But the user says, soften the claim rather than delete it. So the first could say, the mendicant orders that would establish houses of study in Paris in the coming decades were still unknown in the city, though the forces that would produce them moved already in the wider world. Wait, but the user says, soften the claim rather than delete it when unsure. Here the first, I'm fairly sure this is wrong, but let me soften rather than completely remove. Actually, rereading, the mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, established houses of study in Paris in the early 13th century, and already their presence makes itself felt in the quarter. This is clearly wrong for 1205. I should change to indicate this is future from the perspective of 1205, or remove the already and reframe. Let me check other facts. University emerging from cathedral schools in late 12th century correct. Philip Augustus Charter by 1200 correct. Actually 1200 is roughly right, though the exact date of the charter is sometimes debated. 1210 condemnation of Aristotelian texts correct. Parens Scientiarum 1231 correct. 4 faculties correct, though the organization evolved. Left bank transformation correct. Correct. 3. Voice normalization, calm, scholarly British, declarative, no exclamations, no fourth wall, breaks second person throughout. You are standing. Around you. Preserve second person. Do not convert to third person 4. Sentence length, 18-30 words ideally, alternating narrative and descriptive blocks. Break up runs of 5 plus short sentences. Let me scan for short sentence runs. Looking at paragraph 2. The water moves against the stone in small rhythmic sounds, each wave arriving and dissolving with the patience of something that has performed this same motion for centuries and will continue long after the current generation of travelers has passed into memory. One long sentence, fine. Paragraph 3. The University of Paris emerged. Long sentence. The cold air moves. Long. Good. Actually, looking through, most sentences are already quite long. I need to check for runs of short sentences. Paragraph 9. The floor vibrates faintly with the activity of the bakery below, the rhythmic thud of dough being worked, the sharper sounds of loaves being slid into the oven's mouth, and this undertone of ordinary labor provides a strange counterpoint to the abstract considerations unfolding above. Long, very long. Paragraph 14. The brawl spreads and contracts like something alive, individual combatants breaking away and rejoining, the chaos finding its own patterns as you watch from the shelter of a doorway, the rough timber pressing against your shoulder. Long, long. I think the text is already quite good on sentence length, but the first should smooth any clunky ones. Now, the biggest issue is the transition and the deduplication. Transition fix, previous chapter ended with the particular resonance of the space, now emptied of chant, now holding only the smaller sounds of your own breathing, of your own movement, of the night outside entering through openings not yet closed, surrounds you with a different quality of attention, a different demand. The interior current chapter starts with, of the church has settled into stillness, and you are standing at the threshold. So the transition is a different demand. The interior of the church has settled into stillness. This is actually not bad, but the interior at the end of previous and of the church at start of current creates a slight stutter. I should smooth this, perhaps change the opening to remove of the church, since it's implied or restructure. Actually, looking at the text, the first paragraph starts with, of the church has settled into stillness, which is clearly meant to follow the interior. So the combined text would read, the interior of the church has settled into stillness. That's fine. But the first should make sure the transition flows well. The previous paragraph ends with a different demand. The interior, the sentence is incomplete at the end. Then this chapter starts with, of the church has settled. So the complete sentence is, the interior of the church has settled into stillness, and you are standing at the threshold of a different world. This is grammatically fine, but the interior, as a sentence fragment at the end of previous chapter, is intentional for transition. I should make sure the flow works. Maybe the first should adjust the beginning to not need of the church, since it's redundant, or keep it as is. I'll keep the structure but ensure the prose flows smoothly. Actually, I think the issue is that the interior hanging at the end, then of the church has settled, creates a slightly awkward restart. I could change the opening to, inside, the space has settled into stillness, and you are standing. This avoids the repetition and flows better. But wait, the user says, the previous chapter ended with. The interior and then chapter to Polish, followed by of the church has settled. So the transition is literally, the interior of the church has settled into stillness. I should preserve this but perhaps smooth it. Actually, I think I should just let it be or slightly adjust. If the first change of the church to something else, the transition might break. Let me think. Actually, I can edit the beginning of the chapter. The previous chapter ends with the interior that's fixed. The current chapter starts with, of the church has settled. I can change this to create better flow. For example, of the church has settled into stillness and you are standing. Or I could change to, the church interior has settled into stillness. But then, the would duplicate with previous chapters. The previous chapter literally ends with the word, the followed by interior on a new line. Now looking at user input, a different demand. The interior, so the interior is the final two words. Then this chapter starts, of the church has settled into stillness. So together, a different demand. The interior of the church has settled into stillness. This is actually perfectly fine. The interior of the church has settled into stillness is a good sentence. I'll leave this as is, perhaps smoothing what follows. Now let me work through the text systematically, making edits for 1. Flow and transitions. 2. Factual accuracy, especially the mendicant order's anachronism. 3. Deduplication of near-verbatim sentences. 4. Sentence rhythm and clunkiness. 5. Voice consistency. Let me start going through paragraph by paragraph. Paragraph 1. Transition. Of the church has settled into stillness, and you are standing at the threshold of a different world, one that has grown up alongside the sacred spaces of Paris, yet follows its own rhythms, its own calendars, its own forms of devotion. The year is 1205, and the sky above the river is lightening from grey to pearl, the morning mist rising from the water in thin veils that drift across the face of the city. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, watching as a young scholar from Yorkshire disembarks from a small boat that has carried him down from the trading ports of the north. his few books wrapped in oilcloth against the damp of the voyage, his cloak heavy with river smell and the particular cold of early spring. This is fine. Good length, good imagery. I'll keep it mostly intact, perhaps smoothing slightly. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of wine and grain and timber, their voices carrying across the quay in the rough French of the river trade, while further along the bank, fishermen mend their nets with movements that require no thought, only the accumulated knowledge of hands that have performed these tasks since childhood. Good. Maybe smooth, the rough French of the river trade, slightly odd phrasing. Perhaps the rough French of the river trade, or the rough French of trade along the water. I'll keep it. Paragraph 3. The University of Paris emerged in the late 12th century from the cathedral schools of Notre-Dame, and you can trace in the young scholars' posture something of that emergence, the way learning has spilled outward from the cathedral's shadow to claim new territories along the river's edge. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from 10,000 hearths, the faint sweetness of bakeries already at work, the underlying mineral scent of the river itself. You follow the young scholar from Yorkshire as he makes his way along the quay, his boots finding uncertain purchase on the slick stones, his breath visible in the morning air as he asks directions in Latin that carries the flat vowels of his northern upbringing. Fine. Paragraph 4. By 1200, the institution had gained sufficient recognition for Philip Augustus to issue a charter of privileges, and the young scholar from Yorkshire has heard these privileges spoken of in the halls of his monastery: the right to elect masters, the protection of scholars from arbitrary justice, the freedom to teach and to learn that draws men from across the breadth of Europe toward this single point on the map. The streets narrow as you move away from the river, the buildings pressing closer, their upper stories projecting outward to catch what light filters down between the roof lines. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, exists here only in potential, in the hours yet to come. For now, the city fills your ears with the ordinary commerce of morning, the clatter of buckets, the cry of vendors, the distant percussion of a blacksmith hammer finding its rhythm. Good. First instance of the particular silence. Keep this one. Paragraph 5. The left bank stretches before you, and already you can perceive the transformation that the university's growth has wrought upon this quarter. The way the university's growth transformed the left bank from a semi-rural area to a dense quarter of scholars. Wait, this has a near duplicate. The way the university's growth transformed the left bank from a semi-rural area to a dense quarter of scholars is essentially repeated from earlier in the same sentence and also appears later. This is redundant within the sentence itself. The transformation that the university's growth has wrought upon this quarter, and the way the university's growth transformed the left bank from a semi-rural area to a dense quarter of scholars, say the same thing. This needs fixing. I should rewrite. The left bank stretches before you, and already you can perceive the transformation that the university's growth has wrought upon this quarter, the gardens shrinking behind new construction, the old rural character giving way to a dense settlement of scholars, or something similar. Then, gardens that once fed the city now shrink behind new construction, their plots subdivided into rooms for rent, their outbuildings converted to the purposes of lecture and debate. The young scholar from Yorkshire pauses at a corner where a water trough stands, its surface filmed with ice, and splashes his face with water that makes him gasp at the cold before he straightens and continues on his way. Fine. Paragraph 6. At dawn on the left bank, a master lectures on Aristotle's physics in a room above a baker's shop, his students copying frantically, and you find yourself mounting the narrow stairs behind the young scholar from Yorkshire. the warmth of the ovens below rising through the floorboards to meet your chilled hands and feet. The room is long and low, its ceiling beams darkened by years of smoke from the lamps that burn even in daylight, for the quality of winter light in a high window, sufficient for reading only in the middle hours of the day, makes such artificial illumination necessary for the morning's work. The smell of ink and parchment in a cramped scriptorium mixed with the breath of concentration fills the space with a dense, particular atmosphere, the kind of air that seems to hold thought itself in suspension. Good, first instance of the quality of winter light, and the smell of ink and parchment. Keep these. Paragraph 7. The master stands at a lectern, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who has delivered these same arguments many times, yet still finds in them matter for renewed attention. He speaks of motion and rest, of the natural place of elements, of the causes that underlie the phenomena of the physical world, and around him the students bend over their wax tablets and their parchment, their styli moving in the desperate haste of those who know that the master's words will not be repeated, that each sentence must be captured as it falls or be lost to the air forever. Fine. The taste of thin wine and stale bread, the typical sustenance of a poor scholar, will be your portion later, when the lecture ends and the students disperse to their various lodgings and their various fortunes. For now, you remain in the room above the baker's shop, watching the quality of winter light in a high window shift across the master's face as he turns a page of his text and continues his exposition. Good. First instance of the taste of thin wine. Keep this. Paragraph 9. The bells of St. Julien-le-Pauvre mark the hour for disputations in the church porch, and the master concludes his lecture with a gesture that seems to release the students from their concentration, sending them out into the morning with their tablets full of notes they will spend hours deciphering. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, awaits you now. The young scholar from Yorkshire moving with the stream of his new companions toward the sound of the bells, their peals falling through the air with the weight of bronze and the precision of long practice. The church rises before you, its Romanesque bulk softened by the mist that still lingers in the lower streets, its porch already filling with the figures of students arranging themselves in the postures of debate. Good. First instance of the cold stone of a church porch. Keep this. Paragraph 10. The scholastic method of disputation, developed in Paris, involved rigorous logical examination of theological questions, and you watch as two advanced students take their positions before a master who will adjudicate their contest, their voices beginning the formal exchange of argument and counter-argument that will occupy the morning hours. Around you, other students gather to listen, their faces showing the varying degrees of comprehension that mark any such gathering, from the bright attention of those who follow each twist of reasoning to the vague gaze of those who have come for the warmth of proximity, the comfort of being among their kind. Duplicate detected. The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, appears again. This is a near verbatim repeat of the opening clause from paragraph 9. The full sentence is different, but the opening 16 words are identical. I need to rephrase this. I could change to, gradually the cold of the stone transfers its chill upward through leather soles and woolen hose, until the sensation of cold becomes simply the condition of thought, the body accommodating to discomfort as the mind accommodates to the demands of logic. Or, the chill of the porch rises slowly through leather soles and woolen hose, until cold becomes simply the condition of thought. Actually, looking at the instruction again, it says sentences longer than 15 words that appears more than once, verbatim or near verbatim. That's one long sentence. The sentence in paragraph 10 is, "The cold stone of a church porch where students stand for hours of disputation, feet numb, gradually transfers its chill upward through leather soles and woolen hose, until the sensation of cold becomes simply the condition of thought, the body accommodating to discomfort as the mind accommodates to the demands of logic." These are different sentences that share a 16-word opening clause. Are they near verbatim? They share 16 words verbatim at the start. I think this qualifies. I should rephrase the second one. Let me rephrase paragraph 10 opening. The chill of the porch seeps slowly upward through leather soles and woolen hose until cold becomes simply the condition of thought, the body accommodating to discomfort as the mind accommodates to the demands of logic. Paragraph 11. The sound of Latin spoken with a dozen different accents in the narrow streets surrounds the church. For students came from across Europe, from England to Hungary, from Scandinavia to Italy, and each nation has its characteristic pronunciation, its habitual errors, its particular beauty. You hear the clipped consonants of the English, the musical fluidity of the Italians, the heavier rhythms of the Germans, all forced into the common mold of the language of instruction and scholarship that makes communication possible across the boundaries of birth and tongue. The young scholar from Yorkshire finds a place against the church wall, his tablet ready in case the disputation touches upon matters he has studied, his eyes moving between the speakers with the hungry attention of one who has not yet learned which questions are settled and which remain open. Good. Paragraph 12. The morning passes in this fashion, the arguments rising and falling like the breathing of some great organism, the master intervening occasionally to clarify a point or to reprove a fallacy, the crowd of listeners shifting as some depart for other obligations and others arrive to take their places. The first was in paragraph 4. I need to rephrase. For the silence, I could write an ideal silence, the kind that exists between the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, seems to hover even here. Or the concentrated stillness of the scriptorium seems to exist even here. Actually, let me rephrase more substantially. A different quality of attention seems to persist even here, in the midst of spoken debate, as a kind of ideal toward which the disputants strive, the stillness that would contain all answers, all resolutions, all the peace of completed understanding. For the cold stone, the stone beneath your feet has begun to warm slightly where the sun reaches it, though the shadows remain deep and chill. Simpler, no duplicate. Paragraph 13. A dispute between English and French students over the price of wine escalates to a brawl in the Rue du Foire, and you find yourself drawn by the sounds of altercation, the sudden rise in volume that transforms the ordinary murmur of the street into something more urgent, more dangerous. The Rue du Foire runs narrow and crooked, its surface churned to mud by the passage of carts and feet, its overhanging stories nearly meeting overhead so that the sky becomes a thin ribbon of grey between the rooftops. Student life was often disorderly. Conflicts between nations of students and between students and townspeople were frequent, and the tension between those who studied and those who served them, between the temporary population of scholars and the permanent residents of the quarter, found frequent occasion for expression in violence. Fine. Paragraph 14. The young scholar from Yorkshire hangs back at the edge of the crowd that has gathered, his inexperience making him cautious, his northern accent marking him as English, in a moment when such identification carries risk. The sound of Latin spoken with a dozen different accents in the narrow streets has given way to the more visceral language of insult and threat, French and English mingling with the obscenities that require no translation. The cost of living for students varied widely, from wealthy nobles to poor scholars dependent on charity. And this disparity, too, feeds the conflict. The wealthy student who has offered too little for his wine, the poor tavern keeper who cannot afford to lose the difference, the resentments that accumulate when different worlds press against each other too closely. Duplicate. The sound of Latin spoken with a dozen different accents in the narrow streets. Second instance. First, in paragraph 11. Need to rephrase. I'll keep this as first instance. Rephrase. The cosmopolitan murmur of the streets has given way to the more visceral language of insult and threat. Or the learned speech of a dozen nations has given way to the more visceral language of insult and threat. The young scholar from Yorkshire turns away, finding a passage that leads toward the river, his boots slipping in the mud, his breath coming fast with the excitement of proximity to danger. Duplicate. The taste of thin wine and stale bread, the typical sustenance of a poor scholar. Second instance. First, in paragraph 8. Need to rephrase. Rephrase. The memory of thin wine and stale bread seems suddenly precious. Or the meager fare that sustains a poor scholar seems suddenly precious. Paragraph 16. The university was divided into 4 faculties: arts, theology, canon law, and medicine, and the Faculty of Arts on the left bank became the largest and most influential, the gateway through which all students must pass before advancing to the higher studies. You follow the young scholar from Yorkshire as he finds his way to the quarter where the masters of arts hold their informal schools, the rented rooms and church porches and open spaces that serve, in these decades before purpose-built structures, as the theatres of learning. Teaching occurred in rented rooms, churches, and open spaces, not yet in purpose-built structures, and this improvisational quality gives the quarter its character. The lecture that moves from a room above a baker's to the porch of a church as the weather permits, the disputation that takes place in the street where no other space offers itself. But wait, this appears again near the end. Also, teaching occurred in rented rooms, churches, and open spaces, not yet in purpose-built structures. This is essentially repeated from the previous sentence, the rented rooms and church porches and open spaces that serve, in these decades before purpose-built structures. This is redundant within the paragraph. I should rephrase or remove. Actually looking. The rented rooms and church porches and open spaces that serve, in these decades before purpose-built structures, as the theatres of learning. This is very redundant. I should merge or rephrase the second sentence. Rephrase. This improvisational quality gives the quarter its character, the lecture that moves from a room above a baker's to the porch of a church, as the weather permits, the disputation that takes place in the street where no other space offers itself. Paragraph 17. The mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, established houses of study in Paris in the early 13th century, and already their presence makes itself felt in the quarter. The black and white habits of the Dominicans visible among the ordinary dress of the scholars, the grey of the Franciscans moving through the streets in pairs and small groups. Factual error. In 1205, these orders had not yet established houses in Paris. Dominicans, founded 1216, arrived Paris tilde 1217. Franciscans, founded 1209, arrived Paris tilde 1219 to 1220. I need to fix this. I could say, the mendicant orders that would soon transform Parisian learning were still gathering in these years, their founders walking the roads of southern Europe, though the forces that would produce them moved already in the wider world. But the user says, soften the claim rather than delete it. Actually, I can reframe as future from 1205 perspective. In the decades to come, the mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, will establish houses of study in Paris, and already you can perceive the conditions that will summon their presence. The hunger for learning that outstrips the established structures, the poverty of scholars that calls out for new forms of support. The young scholar from Yorkshire pauses to watch a beggar scholar entering a house near the river, the man's carriage suggesting both learning and the ascetic discipline that will make the mendicant orders famous. That's changing quite a bit. Let me think of a softer approach. Actually, looking at the text, the sentence says, established houses of study in Paris in the early 13th century, and already their presence makes itself felt. The early 13th century technically includes 1205, but already is wrong. I could change to, the mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, would establish houses of study in Paris in the early 13th century, and already in 1205, the conditions that would summon them made themselves felt in the quarter, the poverty of poor scholars, the hunger for learning that outstripped established structures, the yearning for a life that combined intellectual rigor with voluntary poverty, or the first could simply make it future-looking. The mendicant orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, were yet to establish their houses of study in Paris, though the century was still young. Yet already the forces that would produce them moved in the quarter, the combination of intellectual ambition and material deprivation that would make such communities necessary, the hunger for a form of learning joined to voluntary poverty. Let me go with something like the mendicant orders that would transform Parisian learning in the decades ahead. The Dominicans and Franciscans were still unknown in the city, their founders yet to gather followers or to walk the roads of Europe. Yet already the conditions that would summon them made themselves felt in the quarter, the poverty of scholars, the gap between learning and life, the yearning for a knowledge that would not separate itself from the world it sought to understand. Then, the young scholar from Yorkshire pauses to watch a poor scholar entering a house near the river, the man's carriage suggesting both learning and the ascetic discipline that will one day make the mendicant orders famous, the combination of intellectual rigor and voluntary poverty that will reshape the university in the decades to come. Wait, but I need to check. Does this preserve the content while fixing the anachronism? The original says, already their presence makes itself felt. I'm changing to say their presence is not felt yet, but the conditions are. This is more accurate. Duplicate. The particular silence of intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the turning of pages, third instance. First in paragraph 4, second in paragraph 12, which I need to fix too. Need to rephrase. Rephrase. A quality of concentrated stillness seems to follow these men like an aura, the intensity of their contemplative life spilling outward into the streets they traverse. Paragraph 18. In 1210, the Bishop of Paris condemns certain Aristotelian texts, the prescription posted at the cathedral door, and though this moment lies 5 years in the future from the young scholar's arrival, you feel its pressure already in the master's lecture on the physics, the careful boundaries drawn around what may and may not be said, the awareness that knowledge itself has become dangerous. The papal bull Seine of 1231, issued by Gregory IX, formally established the university's autonomy, protecting it from such arbitrary intervention. But that protection too lies in the future, and for now, the scholars operate in a space of uncertainty, their intellectual ambitions constrained by the vigilance of authorities who fear where unguided reason might lead. Good. First instance of Seine. Paragraph 19. A poor scholar, unable to afford firewood, lectures with gloved hands, his breath visible in the cold air, and you find him in a room that faces north, away from the sun's path, the stone walls weeping with the damp of winter. His students huddle close, their own breath joining his in clouds of condensation that rise toward the ceiling, their copying slowed by fingers stiff with cold. Duplicate. The quality of winter light in a high window, sufficient for reading only in the middle hours of the day, second instance, first in paragraph 6. Need to rephrase. Also duplicate. The smell of ink and parchment in a cramped scriptorium mixed with the breath of concentration, second instance, first in paragraph 6. Need to rephrase. Rephrase light. The pale winter light that enters through the high window falls upon the master's text in a shifting rectangle that moves across the page as the hours pass. Rephrase smell. The scent of ink and parchment, sharpened by the cold and the proximity of bodies, has here a more insistent quality. Paragraph 20. The young scholar from Yorkshire has found cheaper lodgings in this northern quarter, a corner of a room shared with 3 others, his portion of the rent, consuming nearly all the funds he has brought from home. Duplicate. The cost of living for students varied widely, from wealthy nobles to poor scholars dependent on charity, second instance, first in paragraph 14. Need to rephrase, need to rephrase, need to rephrase. Rephrase cost of living. He occupies the lowest extreme of the economic spectrum that governs student life, from wealthy nobles to those dependent on charity. Rephrase sustenance. His meals consisting of the thin wine and hard bread that he purchases from vendors in the street. Rephrase silence. The concentrated stillness of the scriptorium comes to him only late at night. Paragraph 21. The Latin Quarter on the left bank took its name from the language of instruction and scholarship, and you hear this language everywhere, in every transaction of daily life, the butcher and the baker conducting their business in the tongue that unites the scholars from their distant origins. The young scholar from Yorkshire has begun to lose his self-consciousness about his own accent, to speak more freely in the knowledge that he is one among many foreigners, his strangeness unremarkable in a population defined by displacement. Need to rephrase. Rephrase. This universal tongue, made particular by each speaker's origins, creates a texture of sound unlike any other quarter of the city, the common grammar inflected by the rhythms of English hills or Hungarian plains. Actually, looking at the structure, I can merge. You hear this language everywhere, in every transaction of daily life, the butcher and the baker conducting their business in the tongue that unites the scholars from their distant origins, a texture of sound unlike any other quarter of the city, the universal language made particular by each speaker's origins, the common grammar inflected by the rhythms of English hills or Hungarian plains. Paragraph 22. Albertus Magnus taught in Paris in the 1240s. Thomas Aquinas studied there in the same period, and though these names belong to a future that the young scholar from Yorkshire will not live to see, you sense their approach in the intellectual ferment of the quarter, the growing confidence of the scholastic method, the increasing sophistication of the debates that occupy the masters and their advanced students. The university's intellectual prestige made Paris the leading center of theological and philosophical study in Europe, and this prestige draws ever more students across the dangerous roads and the uncertain waters, the risks of travel outweighed by the promise of learning at its most intense, its most authoritative. Good. First instance of the university's intellectual prestige. Keep. Paragraph 23. At Compline, the sound of hundreds of young men singing in the collegiate chapels drifts across the left. The cold stone beneath your knees has become the cold stone of a market square, where the first grey light of an autumn dawn is beginning to lift the edges of darkness. You are standing at the harbour of Les Halles in the year 1183, and the Seine moves past you with a low murmur, its surface catching the pale luminescence of a sky not yet committed to day. Around you, the barges from upstream and downstream are being made fast to the quay, their hulls scraping softly against the stone with each shift of the current. The market of Les Halles was established by Philip Augustus in this year, and now, in these earliest hours, you are witnessing the first fulfillment of that establishment, the first sacks of grain thumping onto the wet stone, where merchants wait with their tallies ready. The smell of grain dust rises from opened sacks, sweet and slightly fermented, as a burly stevedore lifts his knife to cut the binding on a fresh bale. The dust hangs in the cold air like a kind of pale incense, settling on your sleeves, on the brims of caps, on the folded wings of pigeons that have already begun to gather for the spillage that morning labor always entails. You feel the cold slime of river water on the stone quay where fish will later be gutted, a slickness that comes from the eternal seepage of the Seine, from the drippings of cargo, from the residue of all the mornings that have preceded this one. The sound of cattle lowing in temporary pens reaches you from somewhere beyond the immediate circle of lantern light, the ring of hooves on cobbles announcing the arrival of beasts, driven through the sleeping city from the gates that have only just opened. A housewife from the Isle de la Cité is crossing the Grand Pont with her servant, basket on arm, to buy the day's bread. You see her approaching through the thinning darkness, her cloak pulled tight against the river dam, her steps deliberate on the bridge that connects the island to the right bank, near the cemetery of Saint Innocents where this market was founded. She has risen before the household, before her husband and children stir in their truckle beds, because the best loaves go early, and because the price of wheat has been rising with the autumn rains that delayed the harvest. Her servant carries a smaller basket for the cheese and the small portion of salt fish that will constitute the day's protein, for this is a Friday, and the Christian calendar demands abstinence from flesh. The charter granted to the market specified it as a center for trade in grain, flour, and other foodstuffs. And now, as the light strengthens, you can see the full extent of what this specification has called into being. Stalls are emerging from the gloom like mushrooms after rain, rough tables being erected, awnings unfurled in stripes of faded color that will soon be brilliant when the sun finally clears the rooftops. The visual confusion of color and movement in the crowded market is still only a promise, a gathering of shadows and half gestures, but already the banners are visible against the gray stone of the surrounding buildings, the heraldry of guilds, and the simpler markings of individual traders who have no coat of arms beyond a remembered sign, a painted sheaf, a recognizable face. By 1223, Paris had grown to approximately 100,000 inhabitants, making it among the largest cities in Europe. But here in 1183, that future swelling is only beginning. A pressure felt in the knees of the housewife hurrying for her bread, in the calculations of the royal clerks who have planned this market as both service and revenue. The city's population growth was driven by immigration from the surrounding countryside and from abroad, and already among the early crowd you can detect accents that are not Parisian, faces that remember other landscapes, other rivers less generous than the Seine. The Seine provided the primary means of transporting food to the city, by barge from upstream and downstream, and the river that brought you to this quay is the same river that brings the grain from the Isle de France, the wine from more distant vineyards, the salt fish from coasts you will never see. The surrounding region of the Isle de France supplied grain, while wine came from more distant vineyards, and now a second wave of arrivals is making itself known, the smaller boats that have tied up further along the bank where the water is shallower and the quay less regular. Barrels are being rolled across the planks with a hollow rumble that echoes against the warehouse walls, their staves still dripping from the passage, their contents sloshing with a sound like distant thunder. You taste the promise of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, bought from a market stall that is even now receiving its first delivery from the bakery that has been firing since midnight. The bakers themselves governed by regulations as strict as any that bind the butchers or the fishmongers. The market operated under royal regulation, with officials enforcing weights and measures, and as the housewife from the Isle de la Cité completes her crossing of the Grand Pont with her servant, basket on arm. She will encounter these officials at their stations, their rods and their scales displayed like instruments of a benign but inescapable authority. The growing demand for food transformed the agricultural economy of the surrounding region, drawing more land under the plough, encouraging the clearing of forests, pressing against the ancient rhythms of subsistence with the new urgency of urban appetite. Prices fluctuated with harvests, and shortages could lead to unrest, a fact known to every merchant who watches the sky, who listens for news of weather in counties he has never visited, who calculates the margin between sufficiency and the chaos of an empty belly. The crier is announcing prices for wheat and rye, his voice competing with the bellows of cattle and the squawk of poultry that have been released from their night confinement in the pens behind the grain stalls. You hear him clearly now, his cry rising above the general murmur with a practiced cadence that carries the numbers to the farthest ears, to the housewife pausing at a baker's display, to the steward of a great household who has descended with a cart, and 2 armed men to secure the week's provision before competition drives the cost beyond reach. The particular silence that follows the market's close is unimaginable now, in this hour of gathering, but you will know it later, the empty square echoing with footsteps when the last transaction has been concluded, and the sweepers begin their humble commerce with the day's leavings. Butchers had their own designated quarter and were subject to particular scrutiny, and even now, though their stalls will not be fully active until the full light permits the display of flesh in all its bloody particularity, you can smell the iron tang that lingers from yesterday's killing, the scrubbed boards that retain the memory of every carcass they have borne. The physical infrastructure of Les Halles remained modest, with open-air stalls and temporary structures, and there is nothing here of the permanence that marks the churches, the royal palace, the stone-built confidence of institutions that mean to endure. Canvas flaps in the rising breeze, poles lean slightly under the weight of their coverings. Everything suggests provisionality, the improvisation of need meeting need in a space that could, in theory, be dismantled by nightfall and reconstituted elsewhere. Fish, essential for the many fast days of the Christian calendar, arrived preserved in salt from the coast, and now the salt fish merchants are doing brisk trade in this season of approaching Advent, the air sharp with brine where their barrels stand in ordered rows. You pass among them, the cold slime of river water on the stone quay where fish are gutted now supplemented by the oilier residue of the preserved catch, the scales that cling to every surface, the knives that flash in the strengthening light as the merchants demonstrate the quality of their stock, the firmness of the flesh, the moderation of the salt that has both saved and transformed what was once the abundance of the sea. The taste of fresh bread reaches you again from a point somewhere to your left, where the housewife from the Isle de la Cité has completed her first purchase and pauses to tear a morsel for her servant, a small gesture of solidarity in the press of competing interests. The market's establishment reflected Philip's policy of promoting commerce and controlling its profits, and you can see this double purpose in the placement of the royal officials, in the toll house that stands at the entrance to the square, where every significant transaction will be noted, assessed, made to yield its portion to the crown that has provided this space, this order, this guarantee of fair dealing that is itself a commodity more valuable than any single measure of grain. Tolls and taxes on market transactions provided significant royal revenue, and the clerks who move among the stalls with their wax tablets and their sharp style are the instruments of this extraction, polite, patient, inexorable as the river that brought them all here. In Lent, the saltfish merchants would do even brisker trade. But even now, in this ordinary Friday, the demand is sufficient to keep their hands busy and their voices loud with the praise of their particular barrels, their particular coast, the particular boats that brave the autumn gales to secure this bounty. The sound of cattle lowing in temporary pens, the ring of hooves on cobbles, continues from the quarter where the butchers wait for the morning's business to turn toward flesh, toward the heavy work of slaughter that will transform these patient beasts into the steaks and joints that grace the tables of those who can afford them, who do not observe the fast, or who observe it only when convenience permits. The crier's voice rises again with revised figures, a shift of two deniers that means prosperity for some, ruin for others, the perpetual gamble of those who live by the harvest and its aftermath. A baker caught with short weight is being paraded through the market with his defective loaf around his neck, a spectacle that draws the eyes of the housewife from the aisle de la Cité even as she clutches her own purchase more tightly, reassured by the honest weight of it, the satisfying heft that speaks of a baker who has not yet succumbed to the temptation of the false bottom, the skimped measure, the fractional saving that multiplies across hundreds of loaves into a profit purchased at the cost of public shame. This parade is the visible sign of enforcement, the warning that attends every transaction, the knowledge that the scales are watched, that the rod is ready, that the king's interest in honest dealing is not merely philosophical. The autumn glut of wine is arriving now, barrels rolled from the riverbank to be broached in the taverns nearby, their progress marked by shouts of warning, by the hurried lifting of feet, by the laughter of those who recognize in this annual abundance a temporary suspension of the usual anxieties about cost and measure. The wine from more distant vineyards has traveled farther than any other cargo in this morning's arrival, from slopes that face different suns, from soils that bear different minerals, from the hands of growers who will never see the city that their labor supplies. You stand aside to let a barrel pass, feeling the vibration of its roll through the soles of your shoes, smelling the sharp promise of the broached bung, the first spilled drops that will darken the stone where so much else has already been spilled. The particular silence that follows the market's close is still distant, but you can imagine it now, in the brief lull between the morning's intensity and the midday renewal, the empty square echoing with footsteps of those who have business elsewhere, who have eaten their purchased bread, drunk their morning wine, returned to the occupations that the market serves but does not define. At dusk, the sweepers will gather the day's leavings for pigs and poor, but now, at the height of the morning, the leavings are still being made, the refuse of each transaction falling to the stone to be claimed later by those for whom this market is not a place of purchase, but of salvage, of the gleaning that follows every harvest, however urban. You see them already at the edges of the crowd, the ragged figures who have learned to be invisible, who move with the patience of those who have nothing but time, who will wait until the housewife from the Isle de la Cité has completed her passage back across the Grand Pont with her servant, basket on arm, before they descend to claim what she and others like her have let fall. The smell of grain dust rising from open sacks, sweet and slightly fermented, has now mixed with the smoke of the braziers where chestnuts are being roasted, with the sharpness of the salt fish, with the omnivorous complexity of a human gathering that is itself a kind of fermentation, a transformation of individual hungers into something collective, something that can be regulated and taxed and celebrated and mourned. You move through it, the cold air moving across your face, the sound of cattle lowing in temporary pens, the ring of hooves on cobbles, the taste of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, bought from a market stall where the housewife from the Isle de la Cité has paused again, completing her morning's work with the particular satisfaction of one who has navigated complexity, and emerged with provision sufficient to the day, to the mouths that wait on the island, to the life that continues, meal by meal, in the city that the Seine serves, that the market feeds, that the king, in his wisdom and his need, has brought into being on this right bank, near the cemetery of Saint Innocents, in the year 1183, in the autumn of an empire that does not yet know its own extent. The Wall and the Louvre. Fortifying Europe's capital, you are standing at the edge of a slight rise west of Paris, where fields of wheat and barley have stretched undisturbed for generations, and the first stones of the Louvre keep are being laid in the spring of 1190. Around you, the masons have cleared the ground of stubble and wildflowers, marking out a rectangle in the earth with stakes and twine, and the limestone blocks arriving by cart from quarries near Saint-Cloud have begun to accumulate in pale stacks against the green horizon. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the smell of freshly quarried stone, the same limestone that built Notre-Dame, now rising in massive walls that will alter the shape of this landscape for centuries to come. Philip Augustus, King of France, has ordered this fortress into being before his departure on crusade, and his clerks move among the labourers with tallies and inkhorns, recording each allocation of material and each day of work in the rolls that will travel with the royal household to the Holy Land. The particular quality of light at dawn, seen from the tower of the Louvre, the sun rising over the eastern plain, catches the moisture still clinging to the uncut grass where the moat will soon be dug. You can hear the scrape of shovels as men begin the first trench, the soil dark and heavy with winter rain, and the sound of iron-shod wheels on the new paving approaching the city gates, then the hollow thud of timber barriers, echoes even here at this remove from the existing walls. A heron lifts from the marshy ground where the western ditch will connect to the Seine, its wings broad and unhurried, and the mason from Normandy, having worked on castle construction in England, supervises the coursing of the wall with the particular patience of one who has learned that stone must be laid in its own time, in its own season, or it will betray the hand that placed it. The view from the wall walk, over a city of grey stone and red tile, the river winding through, remains still a prospect of imagination, for the Louvre rises alone in these first months, a promise rather than a fulfillment, and the fields around it continue to produce their grain and pasture their flocks. You are walking now along the trace of the future enceinte, where surveyors have stretched their cords and set their markers, and the cold of the moat water, stagnant in summer, filmed with ice in winter, exists only as anticipation in the minds of those who dig. The taste of dust in the throat after a day laboring on the construction will come to be known by hundreds, then thousands, as the work expands beyond this western extremity to encircle the entire city in a belt of stone 5 kilometers in length. In the autumn of 1190, the first courses of the keep have risen above the height of a man, and the mason from Normandy supervises the coursing of the wall with particular attention to the bonding of the facing stones, which must resist the pressure of the rubble core and the weight of the parapet above. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of lime and sand, of timber for the scaffolding and lead for the flashing, and the particular quality of light at dawn, seen from the tower of the Louvre, the sun rising over the eastern plain, begins to reveal the silhouette of what will become a massive rectangular keep, surrounded by a moat and curtain walls that will guard the approach from Normandy with permanent vigilance. The construction employed techniques developed in Crusader castles and Norman fortifications, and the Norman mason recognizes in this work the same principles he applied at Chateau-Gaillard, though here the purpose is not merely military but administrative, a statement of royal presence at the threshold of the capital. The smell of freshly quarried stone, the same limestone that built Notre-Dame, now rising in massive walls, has begun to permeate the western approach to the city, and travelers from Rouen and Évreux remark upon it as they descend the road from the heights of Seine. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though the harbour here is merely a bank where river craft unload their building materials, and the sound of iron-shod wheels on the new paving approaching the city gates, then the hollow thud of timber barriers, accompanies the arrival of each new consignment. The cold air moves across your face, carrying also the smoke of the lime kilns that burn continuously now, consuming the wood of the surrounding forests in the transformation of chalk into the binder that will hold these walls together. Philip Augustus began construction of this new city wall around Paris in 1190, before departing on crusade, and the work continues in his absence with the authority of his seal and the supervision of his prévots. In 1191, news arrives of Philip's departure for the Third Crusade, the work continuing in his absence with renewed urgency, for the king's absence is itself a vulnerability that the wall must address. You are moving through the streets of the right bank, where the existing wall of Philip's father still marks the boundary, and the new trace will extend far beyond it, north to include the new suburbs and the market of Les Halles, where the butchers and poulterers and fishmongers have established their stalls in growing numbers. The cost was enormous, requiring new taxes and the corvée labour of the city's inhabitants, and the royal clerks move through the parishes with their lists, summoning the men who must give their days to the digging and the hauling, or pay for substitutes if their trade or their station permits such arrangement. You are standing at the edge of the new ditch where the wall will run, and the cold of the moat water, stagnant in summer, filmed with ice in winter, will one day fill this excavation. But for now it is merely a trench of exposed clay and marl, the spoil heaped along its inner edge to form a rudimentary rampart. The wall was built of stone, with a continuous walkway for defenders and regularly spaced towers, and you can trace in the layout of the markers the rhythm of these towers, each one a projection of force into the surrounding countryside, each one a platform for archers and for the engines of war that might be needed in some future siege. The wall represented the largest urban fortification project in northern Europe since antiquity, and the scale of it impresses itself upon the consciousness of even the most illiterate laborer, who understands that something unprecedented is being attempted in his lifetime. A shepherd, his grazing land now enclosed within the new wall, becomes a taxpayer and perhaps a citizen, though the transition from subject of custom to subject of royal administration proceeds unevenly and with much negotiation. You are walking now through the pasture where his flock has grazed, the particular quality of light at dawn, seen from the tower of the Louvre, the sun rising over the eastern plain, falling upon the surveyors as they dispute with him the line of the ditch that will cut through his best meadow. The sound of iron-shod wheels on the new paving approaching the city gates, then the hollow thud of timber barriers, seems to him a sound of invasion rather than protection, and he watches the masons with the suspicion of one whose grandfather's grandfather has held this land without writ or recognition. Yet the wall will come, and with it the necessity of gates, and the gate of Saint-Honoré will rise near enough to his diminished holding that he may find advantage in selling cheese and wool to the guards and the travellers who pass through. You are standing at the base of the rising keep, where the blocks have achieved the height of 3 men, and the cold air moves across your face, carrying the calls of the hodmen as they ascend the ramps with their burdens. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of provisions for the workers, and the fortress served as both military stronghold and treasury for the royal archives, even in this incomplete state. For for the king's chamberlain has already designated chambers for the storage of the rolls and the coin that accompany the exercise of power. On the left bank, the wall enclosed the growing university quarter, where the schools of Notre-Dame and St. Genevieve have attracted scholars from across the lands of the king and beyond, and the trace of the new fortification must accommodate their presence without disrupting the lectures and disputations that constitute the life of the mind. You are moving through the lanes where students crowd the thresholds of the masters, and the view from the wall walk over a city of grey stone and red tile, the river winding through, will one day include the roof of the Petit Pont and the mass of the cathedral rising above the lesser buildings. The cold of the moat water, stagnant in summer, filmed with ice in winter, will border these same lanes, and the Rue des Fossés Saint Bernard and Rue des Fossés Saint Jacques will follow the line of the filled moat, when memory of its purpose has faded into the mere configuration of the streets. You are standing at the site of the future Saint Bernard Gate, where the ditch curves to follow the contour of the old Roman road, and the particular quality of light at dawn, seen from the tower of the Louvre, the sun rising over the eastern plain, reveals the stakes of the surveyors still in place after 20 years, their wood silvered and split by the seasons. The enceinte of Philip Augustus was approximately 5 kilometers in length, and this measurement, which seems abstract in the telling, imposes itself upon the body in the walking of it, in the endless repetition of similar tasks along its entire extent. You are walking now with the mason from Normandy, who supervises the coursing of the wall at the Saint Jacques sector, and he speaks of the castles of the Vexin and the Norman shore, comparing their siting to this placement upon the left bank, where no natural elevation assists the defense. The wall included several gates, each with a defensive barbican: Saint Honoré, Saint Denis, Saint Martin, and others, and the design of these choke points occupies the mason's attention through the winter of 1207, when frost halts the raising of stone and the work turns to the preparation of timber and iron for the coming season. You are standing in the half-completed barbican of the Saint Denis Gate, where the mason from Normandy supervises the coursing of the wall with particular attention to the vaulting of the passage, which must resist the shock of ram and the mining of the enemy. The cold air moves across your face, finding its way through the gaps in the temporary boarding, and the cold of the moat water, stagnant in summer, filmed with ice in winter, lies pooled in the unfinished ditch below, awaiting the connection to the main line of defense. The completion of the Saint Denis Gate in 1208, its towers visible for miles across the flat plain, marks a moment of visible achievement in a project that has consumed nearly 2 decades of labor and treasure. You are standing upon the platform of the southern tower, and the view from the wall walk over a city of grey stone and red tile, the river winding through, extends now to the horizon in every direction, the forest of Montmartre dark to the north, the gleam of the Seine catching the afternoon light as it curves through the enclosure. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in the shelter of the gatehouse, paying their tolls to the royal collector, and the traffic of the Flanders Road passes through under the eyes of the archers who occupy the guard chambers. A royal clerk inventories the treasury moved to the Louvre, the weight of silver coin bending the shelves that have been installed in the lower chamber of the keep, and his voice, reading the tallies aloud, echoes in the vaulted space where once the mason's chisels rang against the stone. You are standing in the doorway of this chamber, and the particular quality of light at dawn, seen from the tower of the Louvre, the sun rising over the eastern plain, filters through the narrow windows to catch the gleam of the coin and the wax of the seals that accompany the rolls of account. The fortress served as both military stronghold and treasury for the royal archives, and the clerk's presence here, in this place of damp and shadow, represents the administrative function that complements the martial purpose of the walls and the towers. You are standing at this watergate in the evening, and the sound of iron-shod wheels on the new paving approaching the city gates, then the hollow thud of timber barriers, reaches you as a distant murmur from the Seine portal, while here all is the slap of oars and the creak of mooring ropes. At night, the watchman's call from the wall towers, marking the hours of the curfew, echoes across the enclosed city and the fields beyond, where the shepherd, his grazing land now enclosed within the new wall, has become a taxpayer and perhaps a citizen, and where his descendants will build houses upon the meadow that the wall has claimed. You are standing at the corner of the St. Martin Barbican, and the cold air moves across your face, carrying the call from the next tower, and the next, as the message of the hour passes around the entire circuit of 5 kilometers. You are standing at the gate of the Louvre, where he takes his leave of the clerk of works, and the particular quality of light at dawn, seen from the tower of the Louvre, the sun rising over the eastern plain, catches the dust upon his travelling cloak. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes for the last time under his observation, and the sound of iron-shod wheels on the new paving approaching the city gates, then the hollow thud of timber barriers, has become for him the signature sound of a completed life, a phase closed. On the left bank, the Rue des Fossés Saint-Bernard and Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques follow the line of the filled moat, and you are walking now in imagination along these future streets, where the wall's course is still traceable in the modern street pattern of Paris, though the wall itself has vanished into the cellars and the foundations of later buildings. The wall extended north on the right bank to include the new suburbs and the market of Les Halles, and south on the left bank to enclose the growing university quarter, and the taste of dust in the throat after a day laboring on the construction persists only in the documents of the clerks who recorded the payments and the penalties, the absences and the substitutions. The wall was completed by 1210, enclosing an area far larger than the old Gallo-Roman fortifications, and the clerk notes in his register the completion of what Philip Augustus began construction of in 1190, before departing on crusade, 20 years of labor compressed into a single entry of satisfaction and transfer to the permanent officers of the watch. The shepherd, his grazing land now enclosed within the new wall, has become a taxpayer and perhaps a citizen, and you are standing at his door in the Rue aux Fèves, where he has built upon the strip of ground that remained to him after the ditch took his meadow. You are standing at the edge of the moat, as the last light drains from the western sky, and the herons rise from the reeds with slow, deliberate wings. The Louvre's completed walls rise behind you, pale stone catching the final glow, and you turn away from the water to follow the path that leads inward, toward the narrow streets where the city gathers its breath before the long descent into night. The cold of the moat water has seeped into your boots, and you feel the damp cling to your woolen hose as you walk, the rough texture of the fabric chafing slightly with each step, the universal fabric of medieval clothing that wraps every body in this city in its coarse embrace. The street level here is lower than the original ground, sunk by centuries of accumulated rubbish and rebuilding, so that the thresholds of the older houses sit half a step above the path, and the door frames lean slightly with the settling of time. You're walking now through streets where the houses press close, timber-framed structures with wattle-and daub walls and thatched roofs, each narrow and deep, with a shop or workshop on the ground floor and living quarters above. The upper stories frequently overhang the street, reducing the already limited light and air, so that you walk in a perpetual half-gloom even when the sky above is bright. the buildings leaning toward one another like whispering neighbors. The smell of wood smoke from 10,000 hearths hangs in the cold air of this windless evening, a thin haze that drifts at the level of the overhangs and settles in the throat with the taste of every dinner being prepared behind shuttered windows. The Rue Saint-Honoré stretches before you in the darkness, and you are standing at the harbour at dawn, though this harbour is of houses, of waking lives, of the first stirrings behind oiled cloth windows. A midwife rises before dawn in the Rue Saint-Honoré, her birthing satchel ready for the day's first call, and you follow her as she steps into the street, her wooden pattens clacking against the packed earth and cobbles, the sound amplified by the canyon of overhanging houses that receives and returns every noise. She is Marguerite, called to the house of a spice merchant whose wife has labored through the night, and she carries linen strips and a small knife and the dried herbs that ease the passage, and her own hands, which have delivered 47 infants in this parish alone. Marguerite walks with the certainty of one who knows these streets in darkness, the Rue Saint-Honoré, the Rue Saint-Denis, the winding alleys that connect them like veins, and she does not pause as she passes the church of Saint-Troch, where the night watch has just completed his rounds and the first candles are being lit for lauds. The quality of light in a narrow street at midday, a single band of sky visible between the roof lines, will not come for hours yet, and now the darkness holds everything close, the cold of stone walls in winter seeping outward, the damp rising through plaster and timber to meet the air that moves across your face. You feel this cold as you stand in the doorway of a baker's shop, watching the first glow appear behind the shutters, and at first light, a baker rakes the overnight coals, the smell of rising dough mingling with wood smoke. His name is Jan, and he has slept on the floor beside his oven, as bakers do, to tend the fire through the dark hours, and now he works the embers into life with a long iron rake, his face gleaming with sweat despite the chill. The dough he set to rise overnight has swollen in its wooden trough, pale and yeasty, and he turns it out onto the flowered bench with a sound like a sigh. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, though this harbour is of bread, of the daily sustenance that passes from oven to hand to mouth across the waking city, and the smell of wood smoke from 10,000 hearths hangs in the cold air of this windless morning, mingling now with the particular sweetness of fermenting grain. The baker's wife descends from the chamber above, where the family sleeps in the quarters over the shop, and she carries the infant to the street door to breathe the fresher air, though fresher is a relative term in streets where sanitation is primitive, where waste is thrown into the street or into cesspits that periodically require emptying. She holds the child wrapped in rough wool, and you feel the texture of rough wool against the skin, the universal fabric of medieval clothing, as she adjusts the swaddling, and the infant's face emerges, pale and serious, into the grey morning. The street level here, as in so many places, has sunk below its original mark, so that the threshold stands higher than the path, and the wife must step down carefully, her pattens finding purchase on the uneven surface. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, though the cargoes here are of flour and kindling, of the materials that sustain the baker's trade, and the sound of footsteps on packed earth and cobbles begins to multiply as the city wakes. You follow the baker's wife as she returns indoors, and the scene shifts with the rising sun to a house on the Rue de la Harpe, where a merchant's wife inspects the accounts with her husband's clerk, her seal ring authorizing transactions in his absence. She is Alex, widow of a draper who traded with the fairs of Champagne, those great markets accessible by river, and her husband's death 3 years past has left her with the shop and the stock, and the responsibility of maintaining his connections. The clerk reads aloud from a parchment, his voice low and precise, and Alex follows with her finger, not fully literate, but knowing the shapes of names and numbers, the record of cloth received and coin dispersed. Her seal ring, engraved with her husband's mark, now transferred to her keeping by guild custom and the tolerance of her neighbors, presses into the wax with a soft crackle, and the document is complete. The cold air moves across your face as you leave Alex's house, and you walk now toward the cathedral, where the morning has advanced toward noon. The masons have paused in their labor, descending from the scaffolding where they have been fitting stone since prime, and they gather in groups on the parvis, unpacking their provisions. The noon bell finds a laborer eating bread and onions on the steps of a closed shop, watching cathedral masons at their dinner, and you sit beside him, though not too close, for he is a stranger, and the city teaches caution. His name is Pierre, though you do not ask it, and he has carried rubble from the quarry since before dawn, his back bent and his hands thick with callus, and the bread he eats is yesterday's, hardening at the edges, the onions sharp enough to make his eyes water. You taste the well water he offers, slightly metallic from the pipes that bring it from the public fountain established by the nearby monastery of Saint Victor, and you drink sparingly, for water is never fully trusted, and river water, slightly foul, is worse. The masons eat better, you observe, or at least more abundantly, for their craft is skilled and their guild strong, and they have cheese and sausage, and a flask of wine passed from hand to hand. Children are considered adults at a relatively young age, entering apprenticeships or service in their early teens, and among the masons you notice a boy of perhaps 12, his arms already muscular from carrying hod, his face smeared with stone dust. He laughs at something an older man says, and the sound carries across the parvis, bright and brief, and you remember that the average lifespan is short, with high infant mortality and vulnerability to epidemic disease, so that every laugh is a kind of defiance, every meal a small victory. The cold of stone walls in winter is forgotten in this moment of noon warmth, the sun finding its angle down the narrow streets to pool in unexpected places, and the damp rising through plaster and timber seems distant, though it will return with the evening. You leave the laborer to his rest and walk south, toward the river, where the tanneries cluster on the beaver's banks, and the afternoon finds you in a street where an afternoon dispute between a tanner and his neighbor over the stench of his vats has drawn a crowd. The tanner is Robert, and his vats of oak bark and lime and half-rotted hides produce an odor that penetrates every neighboring house, and his neighbor, a parchment maker named Gautier, has finally brought the complaint before the local provost. The provost listens with the weary patience of one who has heard 1,000 such complaints, and the tanner argues that his trade is necessary, that hides must be cured, that the city cannot clothe itself without his labor. The neighbor counters that his own trade suffers, that the parchment he prepares for the scriptorium discolors with the tanner's fumes, that his wife cannot sleep for the stench. You smell it now, the particular sourness of the vats, and you taste the river water, slightly foul, that feeds them, and you feel the cold air move across your face as the provost declares his judgment. The tanner may continue, but must cover his vats, and must not open them on days when the wind blows toward the parchment maker's house. It is a compromise, imperfect, typical of the city's governance, and the crowd disperses with the murmur of those who have witnessed justice done, or done as well as it can be in streets where sanitation is primitive, where waste is thrown into the street or into cesspits that periodically require emptying, where every trade produces its own particular offense against the senses. The sun has descended toward the west as you leave the provost's court, and you walk now through streets where the houses narrow and deepen, where the shop or workshop on the ground floor gives way to living quarters above, and the upper stories frequently overhang the street, reducing the already limited light. and air. Religious life permeates daily existence, with some 60 parish churches and numerous monasteries in and around the city, and this feast of Saint Severin himself draws the faithful from the surrounding streets, their faces pale in the gathering dusk, their candles small stars against the darkening houses. The procession moves slowly, singing the hymn, and the sound of footsteps on packed earth and cobbles is muffled now by the press of bodies, amplified by the canyon of overhanging houses that receives and returns every noise as echo, as memory, as the accumulated weight of generations who have walked this way before. The saint's image, carried on a litter by 4 burly men from the parish guild, sways above the candles, and you see the faces of the city's inhabitants as they pass. Nobles, clergy, merchants, artisans, labourers, servants, and the poor, each in their degree, each with their particular hope to place before the saint's intercession. The women walk together, some with infants at the breast, their lives constrained by law and custom, though widows and single women can exercise some economic independence, and you notice Alex the draper's widow among them, her seal ring glinting in the candlelight, her face composed in devotion. The children who are old enough to walk, considered adults at a relatively young age, entering apprenticeships or service in their early teens, carry smaller candles and struggle to keep them lit in the still air, their faces serious with the importance of the task. The average lifespan is short, with high infant mortality and vulnerability to epidemic disease, and in the flickering light you see the thinness of some cheeks, the pallor that speaks of fever survived or impending, and yet they walk, they sing, they carry their candles through the Rue Saint-Séverin and into the Rue Saint-Jacques, and the procession winds like a river of light through the darkness that has fully fallen now. Night falls early in winter, the curfew bell sending law-abiding citizens indoors, while watchmen patrol the dark streets, and you hear the first strokes from the tower of the Louvre, from the watch posts along the wall, as the procession disperses at the church door. The cold of stone walls in winter greets you as you pause in an alley, the damp rising through plaster and timber to meet the night air, and you feel the texture of rough wool against the skin, the universal fabric of medieval clothing, as you pull your mantle closer. The sound of footsteps on packed earth and cobbles diminishes, amplified by the canyon of overhanging houses that now holds only silence and the occasional voice raised in farewell or warning. A watchman passes, his lantern swinging, and he does not challenge you, for you have the look of one who belongs, or perhaps he is too tired, too cold, too mindful of his own small authority to exert it against the harmless. You taste the well water from a fountain closed for the night, slightly metallic, and you spit it out, for even water tastes different in darkness, and river water, slightly foul, would be worse. Fire is a constant danger, with thatched roofs and timber construction, and you remember the major fires that occurred in 1218 and 1220, the years still spoken of in hushed voices, the years when whole quarters burned and the sky was visible not as a single band between roof lines, but as a vast dome of flame. The houses are narrow and deep, with a shop or workshop on the ground floor and living quarters above, and in each one a hearth is banked, a candle extinguished, a body settling into the straw or the mattress or the floor, and the smell of wood smoke from 10,000 hearths hangs in the cold air of this windless evening, the only sign of life in streets that have surrendered to darkness. You walk now toward the river, drawn by the sound of water, and you find the quay where the boats are moored, their cargoes of wine and stone and timber from the great fairs of Champagne accessible by river, silent and dark. The Seine flows with its perpetual murmur, and you are standing at the harbour at dawn, though this harbour is of night, of the city's unconscious, and you feel the cold air move across your face from the open water, carrying the damp of the marshes upstream, the faint salt of the sea still distant. The legal system involved overlapping jurisdictions: royal, ecclesiastical, seigneurial, and municipal, and in the darkness you sense all of them as layers, as sediment, as the accumulated governance of centuries that holds this city together and holds it in tension. The provost's compromise, the bishop's court, the king's officers, the lord's ancient rights. The watchman's call echoes from somewhere east, and you turn back into the streets, walking without destination now, letting the city guide your steps. The Rue Saint-Honoré, where Marguerite the midwife rose before dawn, her birthing satchel ready for the day's first call, lies quiet, her house indistinguishable from its neighbors, the timber-framed structure with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof, narrow and deep, with a shop or workshop on the ground floor and living quarters above. You pass the bakery where Jehan raked the overnight coals, the smell of rising dough mingling with wood smoke, now faded into the general night, and you pass the house where Alex the widow inspected the accounts with her husband's clerk, her seal ring authorizing transactions in his absence, the seal ring that glinted in the candlelight of the procession. The herons are sleeping now, folded into themselves on their perches in the reeds, and the water holds only the reflection of stars, of the watchman's lantern passing along the wall above, of your own face if you leaned close enough to see it, pale and strange in the medieval dark. The street level was often below the original ground level due to accumulated rubbish and rebuilding, and here at the moat's edge you feel this sinking, this accumulation, as the weight of centuries presses down, as the city grows not upward but inward, layer upon layer, life upon life. You turn from the water and walk back into the streets, and the curfew bell sounds again, a single stroke marking some division of the night, and you are standing at the harbour at dawn, though this harbour is of waiting, of the long hours before light returns, and you find a doorway to shelter in, the cold of stone walls in winter at your back, the damp rising through plaster and timber to meet the wool of your mantle. The sound of footsteps on packed earth and cobbles approaches, pauses, passes. The watchman on his rounds, or perhaps another sleepless soul, a midwife called to a birth, a baker going early to his oven, a child woken by nightmare or hunger. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, and this time it is dawn, the first grey seeping into the single band of sky visible between the roof lines, the quality of light in a narrow street at midday still hours away, but presaged in this pallor, this promise. The cold air moves across your face with a new edge, a new direction, and you smell the change, the faint sweetness of morning after the long night of smoke and tallow and breath. The watchman passes for the last time, his lantern pale and unnecessary now, and he nods to you, or perhaps to the dawn itself, and you nod back. And the gesture completes something, some circle of vigilance and survival, of the daily life that continues in these narrow streets despite everything. Because of everything, in the timber-framed houses with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, narrow and deep, with a shop or workshop on the ground floor and living quarters above, where the upper stories frequently overhang the street, reducing the already limited light and air, where the street level was often below the original ground level due to accumulated rubbish and rebuilding, where water was drawn from the Seine or from wells, with some public fountains established by religious houses, where sanitation was primitive, where waste was thrown into the street or into cesspits that periodically required emptying, where fire was a constant danger, with thatched roofs and timber construction, where the city's inhabitants included nobles, clergy, merchants, artisans, laborers, servants, and the poor, where guilds regulated many trades, controlling entry, quality, and prices, where religious life permeated daily existence, with some 60 parish churches and numerous monasteries in and around the city, where markets and fairs punctuated the commercial year, with the great fairs of Champagne accessible by river, where the legal system involved overlapping jurisdictions: royal, ecclesiastical, seigneurial, and municipal, where women's lives were constrained by law and custom, though widows and single women could exercise some economic independence, where children were considered adults at a relatively young age, entering apprenticeships or service in their early teens, where the average lifespan was short, with high infant mortality and vulnerability to epidemic disease. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, and the harbour is the city itself, is the narrow street that opens before you as the light grows, is the life that has continued through the night and will continue through this day and through days unnumbered. And you step forward into it, into the rough wool and the wood smoke and the metallic water and the stone cold and the flickering candles and the footsteps on cobbles, into the daily life of these narrow streets that is the life of every city in every age, particular and universal, past and present, dream and waking, and the sound of footsteps fades behind you, and the morning light finds you standing at the harbour at dawn, where the river moves slowly beneath a pale sky, and the air carries the particular stillness of a city that has not yet begun its daily labour. The water is the colour of old pewter, and the few boats that have already cast off drift without urgency toward the eastern bends. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in silence, their movements subdued by the weight of what has passed in the night. The cold air moves across your face, bearing with it the faint mineral scent of the river and something else, something heavier, that you will come to know as the smell of incense at Philip's funeral, heavy and foreign, masking the familiar odors of the city that he built across 43 years of reign. It is the 14th day of July in the year 1223, and Philip Augustus has died at Mantes-la-Jolie, after a reign of 43 years that transformed the modest royal town of his accession into the largest city in Europe. His body is being prepared for the journey to Saint Denis, where the kings of France lie among their saints and their accumulated memory. The news has travelled ahead of him along the roads and the river, reaching the city before dawn, and now the streets await their king's final passage through them. You are standing among those who have risen early to witness what they cannot yet fully comprehend, the end of an age measured in the length of one man's life and the breadth of his ambition. The summer heat of July presses already against the stone of the embankment, and the stone of the streets radiates warmth into the evening that will follow this morning, preserving the day's heat long after the sun has descended. The sound of the death bell, slow and deliberate, from Notre-Dame's tower, reaches you across the water, each stroke separated by a silence that seems to hold its own weight. The bell has been cast in the lifetime of the dead king, hung in the tower he watched rise through the decades of his reign. Its voice carries across the rooftops and the river, finding its way into the narrow streets where the wooden houses of 1180 have largely disappeared, replaced by stone and mortar and the confidence of a city that knows itself to be the center of something larger than its own walls. You move with the gathering crowd toward the Grand Pont, where the procession will eventually cross, and the particular silence of a city in mourning surrounds you, the ordinary noises subdued by the consciousness of what has ended. The merchants have paused in their unloading. The boatmen stand at their tillers without speaking. Even the gulls seem to wheel more quietly above the slow water. The body of Philip Augustus is carried toward the city he transformed, and you find yourself among the throng that lines the Rue Saint Denis, that ancient way that survives 8 centuries and more, its name persisting through languages and regimes and the slow erasure of memory. The street has been paved in your lifetime, the mud and the mire of earlier days replaced by fitted stone that carries the sound of hooves and wheels with a clarity that seems almost deliberate, as if the city now wishes to announce its own solidity. The coffin passes slowly, draped in the royal blue and the fleur-de-lis, and the smell of incense at Philip's funeral rises in clouds from the censers swung before and behind, heavy and foreign, masking the familiar odors of the city that would otherwise assert themselves. The river mud, the animal dung, the smoke of 1,000 hearths, the particular human density of roughly 100,000 souls gathered within walls that did not exist when this king first wore his crown. The city's population of roughly 100,000 far exceeded London's estimated 40,000 or Rome's diminished numbers, and this fact manifests in the press of bodies around you, the sheer physical assertion of numbers that makes Paris the largest city in Europe. You follow the procession at a distance, moving through streets that Philip Augustus caused to be transformed, the physical transformation of the city, paved streets, new walls, expanded markets, provided the infrastructure for continued growth that his son will inherit. The walls rise on either side of you as you approach the northern gate, stone replacing timber, height replacing vulnerability, the circuit of defense that encloses not merely the inhabitants, but the idea of the city itself as something permanent, something that might outlast the generations that build and dwell within it. The taste of wine from the royal cellars, broached for the funeral feast, lingers in the mouths of those who have already begun the rituals of commemoration. A young wine from the previous autumn's pressing, sharp with the memory of harvest and the promise of years it will not see. You do not drink, but you smell it on the breath of the mourners who pass you, their faces marked by something more complex than grief, something that recognizes in this death the closing of an era they had not expected to end. The Abbey of St. Denis receives its king in the afternoon light that falls through the rose window, still incomplete, still promising a perfection that will outlive those who conceived it. The Gothic style perfected in Paris at Notre-Dame would spread across Europe, carried by the city's architects and craftsmen. And here at St. Denis, the first experiments of that style already assert their vertical ambition. They're reaching toward light and height that characterizes what will become, in the mouths of later critics, the French manner. You stand at the rear of the nave, where the air is cooler and the incense gathers in layers, and you watch the ceremony proceed with the deliberate pace of institutions that know themselves to be eternal. The monks chant the offices for the dead in voices trained to uniformity, and the sound of the death bell has ceased now, its function fulfilled, its silence as present as its sounding was. The burial completes what the death began, and you return to the city in the evening, when the summer heat of July has begun to moderate, and the stone of the streets radiates warmth into the evening with a generosity that seems almost animate. The particular silence of a city in mourning has begun to fracture, the ordinary noises subdued no longer by shock, but by the slower rhythm of accustomed grief, the acceptance that life continues because it must. You walk the circuit of the walls, rising now to the height that Philip Augustus decreed, and the visual impression of the city from the walls at dusk unfolds before you, the river golden in the westering light, the towers and rooftops emerging from the haze of dust and smoke that hangs above any concentration of human habitation. The river catches the last light and holds it, transforms it, becomes itself a source of illumination that seems to answer the sky rather than merely reflect it. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes still, or perhaps again, the commerce of the city resuming its patterns because commerce does not pause for mortality, and the cold air moves across your face with the first suggestion of the night's coolness. The Louvre stands in its new solidity, no longer merely a fortress on the western edge, but the seat of something more complex, and you find yourself within its chambers in the days that follow, where the final inventory of the Louvre treasury proceeds with the methodical attention of clerks, who understand that what they record will outlast their own names. The accumulated wealth of 4 decades of royal accumulation lies spread across tables, the silver in ingots and worked plate, the coin in bags whose weight has been calculated and recalculated, the jewels and the seals, and the documents that record rights and revenues, and the intricate web of obligation that binds the kingdom together. The royal treasury, established in the Louvre, became the financial center of the kingdom, and you watch the clerks move among the records with the familiarity of those who have made this space their own, their fingers tracing lines of Latin abbreviation, their voices murmuring figures that accumulate towards sums whose magnitude they can articulate, but perhaps not truly comprehend. The administrative institutions developed under Philip laid the groundwork for the later Parliament of Paris, and in the careful recording of this inventory, you perceive the first shadow of that later body, the habit of documentation and deliberation that will characterize French governance for centuries to come. The taste of wine from the royal cellars has given way now to the ordinary beverages of daily sustenance, and you find yourself in a tavern near the Petit Pont, that crossing which survives 8 centuries and more in its essential function, if not its precise form. The river moves below, and the sound of it provides a continuous undertone to the conversation around you, which turns inevitably to the succession, to the young Louis VIII, who has become king in his father's final hours. The administrative and legal reforms of Philip's reign, many centered on Paris, strengthened royal authority throughout the kingdom, and those who gather here speak of these matters with the particular authority of those who have observed them at close range, who have paid the taxes and petitioned the courts, and watched the royal officials move through the streets with their seals and their summonses. The city's self-government remained limited, with the crown maintaining tight control over municipal affairs, and this too is part of the conversation, the recognition that growth and prosperity have their price in autonomy and the old ways of managing common concerns. You rise in the morning and find the city already engaged in its labors, the particular silence of a city in mourning gradually yielding to the ordinary noises, subdued no longer but merely present, the background against which life continues. The young Louis VIII approaches from the south, and you stand among the crowd at the Port Saint-Michel to witness his arrival, his walls and towers testimony to his father's vision rising around him as he rides through streets that have been prepared for this moment. The new king is 36 years old, mature by the standards of his age, already experienced in war and administration, the father of sons who will continue the Capetian line that Philip Augustus secured and extended. The procession moves with a deliberation that speaks of calculation, of the awareness that this spectacle constitutes a form of governance, the visible assertion of continuity that reassures those who might otherwise question whether the city and the kingdom can survive the transition. You watch the young king entering the city of his inheritance, and the cold air moves across your face with the freshness of morning, bearing the scent of the river and the bakeries and the accumulated humanity of the largest city in Europe. The weeks pass and the months, and you find yourself returning to Notre-Dame, where the work continues on the western facade, the towers rising as he had planned, the completion proceeding through the hands of craftsmen who did not know the king whose vision they execute. The sound of chisel on stone provides a continuous percussion, rhythmic and patient, and the smell of incense at Philip's funeral has long since dissipated, replaced by the dust of construction and the glue of mortar and the simple human presence of workers who labor and sweat and pause to eat their bread in the shadow of what they build. You are standing at the harbor at dawn once more, though months have passed, and the river moves slowly beneath a sky that carries the first suggestion of autumn, the air clearer now, the light more acute in its angles. The years accumulate, and you find yourself in the university quarter, where the university's prestige continued to grow, attracting scholars who would define medieval thought, and where a scholar of the next generation sits reading in the university library, encountering a manuscript copied in Paris in 1220, in the very year when Philip Augustus still lived, and the city still grew toward the form it would assume. You observe this scholar without being observed, the second person of your presence felt but not seen, the quiet immersion that permits witness without intervention. The manuscript contains the theology of Peter Lombard, the sentences that will become the standard text of theological education, copied here in Paris, when the king was still consolidating his victories over the Plantagenets, when the annexation of Normandy in 1204 had brought the richest province of France under direct royal control, and the scribes of this city were already becoming numerous enough to supply the intellectual appetites of a continent. The scholar's finger traces the lines of text, and the summer heat of July seems distant now, preserved only in the memory of those who lived through it and the documents that record its events. The gradual forgetting of the muddy streets, the wooden houses, the modest town of 1180 proceeds apace, as the new city effaces memory with the thoroughness of physical replacement. You walk where the Grand Rue meets the Rue Saint-Denis, and the names persist even as the surfaces change. The persistence of these names and ways providing a continuity that exists alongside the transformation. The smell of incense at Philip's funeral has become a memory preserved in chronicle and oral tradition, the particular sensory moment generalized into the fact of ceremony, the heavy and foreign quality of it lost to those who did not experience it directly. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes with the energy of a city that has resumed its full vigor, the mourning completed, the succession secured, the future once again a matter of aspiration rather than anxiety. The visual impression of the city from the walls at dusk remains available to you, and you climb to the ramparts in the evening of a late summer day, the river golden in the westering light, the towers of Notre-Dame now complete in their massing, if not in their final detail, the mass of human habitation spreading beyond the old limits toward the new walls that Philip Augustus caused to be built. You observe the carts arriving from the provinces, the revenues of the realm converging on this point, the physical concentration of wealth that makes possible the physical concentration of power. The clerks who move through the Louvre's chambers carry themselves with the gravity of those who know themselves to be participating in something that will extend beyond their own mortality. The taste of wine from the royal cellars has become a general taste. The vineyards of the Ile-de-France and the valleys of the Seine and its tributaries producing for a market that the largest city in Europe creates by its own consumption. You find yourself in a vintner's shop near the Place de Grève, where the barrels are stacked in orderly rows, and the proprietor discusses the merits of various vintages with the confidence of one whose expertise has been accumulated across years of discerning selection. The particular silence of a city in mourning belongs now to other occasions, other deaths, the ordinary noises subdued in their turn for other griefs, other transitions. The city has absorbed the death of its king and continued, as cities do, as the city of your presence does, the life that continues through the night and will continue through this day and through days unnumbered. The decades after Philip's death witnessed the completion of Notre-Dame's western facade, the towers rising as he had planned, and you stand in the Parvis before the cathedral on a morning when the light falls directly through the rose window, casting its pattern of color on the stone pavement where the faithful gather and disperse. The sound of the death bell has sounded for others in the years between, and will sound again, the bell's voice becoming part of the city's continuous present, its marking of moments that accumulate into the texture of lived experience. You walk the circuit of the walls once more, and the cold air moves across your face with the particular quality of a late autumn afternoon, the year's warmth retreating toward memory, the stone of the streets radiating warmth into the evening with a diminishing intensity that speaks of the seasons turning. The physical transformation of the city, paved streets, new walls, expanded markets, provided the infrastructure for continued growth, and you observe the evidence of this growth in the new constructions beyond the old wall of Philip Augustus, the city pressing outward toward the new enclosure that will be built in your children's or your grandchildren's time, the perpetual expansion that characterizes the living city. The Paris that emerged from Philip's reign laid groundwork that would shape the future metropolis, with some street alignments, routes like the Rue Saint-Denis and the Grand Rue, and the Petit Pont persisting for centuries, while the cathedral and the river continue to orient the city's development. The evening finds you once more at the harbor, where the river moves slowly beneath a sky that carries the first stars, and the air has taken on the particular quality of autumn coolness that seems to sharpen the senses even as it invites retreat toward warmth and enclosure. The river, golden in the westering light, has yielded to the river silver in the rising moonlight, the transformation continuous and unremarked, the city passing through its daily and seasonal cycles with the persistence that will characterize it across the centuries to come. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though it is not dawn but dusk, the second person of your presence shifting in time without shifting in place, the immersive quality of witness that permits you to be present to what has passed and what will come. A scholar of the next generation, reading in the university library, has grown old in your observation. His encounter with a manuscript copied in Paris in 1220 leading him through a lifetime of commentary and disputation. The university's prestige continued to grow, attracting scholars who would define medieval thought, and his own contributions modestly added to this accumulation. He has witnessed the working of these reforms in the courts that met in the parvis of Notre-Dame and in the chambers that were built to house them, the gradual formalization of procedure that will culminate in the institutions of later centuries. The sound of the death bell persists in the bell's continued existence, its voice still capable of the same solemn measure, though the occasions of its sounding have multiplied and diversified across the decades. You are standing among the faithful when it sounds for the feast of Saint Denis, and the particular silence of a city in mourning is not present, but rather a different silence, the attentive stillness of collective devotion, the ordinary noises subdued by reverence rather than grief. The summer heat of July returns in your experience, though years have passed, the stone of the streets radiating warmth into the evening with the same generous retention that you observed in the days of the funeral, the season's cycle asserting itself across the accumulation of individual deaths and successions. The young Louis VIII has himself died in 1226, after a reign of only 3 years, his son Louis IX, a child who will grow to become Saint Louis. The Capetian line continuing through the vulnerability of minority and the resilience of institutions that Philip Augustus established. The victory over the Plantagenets at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214 helped secure the territorial basis of France, and the annexation of Normandy in 1204 had brought one of the richest provinces under direct royal control, establishing precedents for centralized administration. You find yourself in the Louvre once more, though the treasury has grown beyond its original chambers, the final inventory succeeded by inventories without end. The accumulated wealth of 4 decades of royal accumulation become the accumulated wealth of centuries, the sums incomprehensible in their magnitude, the records extending through rooms that did not exist when you first observed the clerks at their tables. The royal treasury remains the center of something larger now than the Kingdom of France. The kingdom itself expanded and transformed by the same processes of accumulation and administration that Philip Augustus initiated. The taste of wine from the royal cellars has been succeeded by the taste of other wines, other occasions, the specific yielding to the general, the particular moment of commemoration becoming the continuous present of royal and national celebration. The Rue Saint-Denis, the Grand Rue, the Petit Pont, names and ways that have survived many centuries, assert themselves in your footsteps as you walk these ways once more. The surfaces changed, the buildings risen and risen again, the essential lines of movement persisting through transformation. The cold air moves across your face, and you perceive in this sensation the continuity of physical experience across the decades, the body's persistence in its capacities and its limitations, the second person of your presence remaining available to what the city offers of sensory immersion. The 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337, would test the city's loyalty and prosperity, but its position as capital was by then unassailable, and you observe in the decades before this testing the establishment of that unassailability, the processes by which a city becomes necessary to the imagination of a people, the place that cannot be abandoned because too much has been invested in its survival, too much meaning accumulated in its stones and its institutions. You observe the sessions of the Parliament as it gradually assumes a more formal institutional role, the deliberation of magistrates who inherit habits of documentation and deliberation that recall the careful recording of the Louvre inventory, with administrative developments under Philip arguably laying some groundwork for this later body. The sound of their voices, murmuring in the chambers built to house them, carries something of the same quality you heard in the clerks at their tables, the gravity of those who know themselves to be participating in something that will extend beyond their own mortality. The evening finds you walking the circuit of the walls once more, the cold air moving across your face with the particular quality of a winter evening, the year's cycle completing itself, the stone of the streets radiating warmth into the evening with a diminished intensity that speaks of the season's depth. You look out across the river, silver now in the moonlight, and the city spreads before you in its essential configuration, the river defining its shape, the walls defining its limit, the towers defining its aspiration. The particular silence of a city in mourning has long since passed, has become one silence among many in the city's continuous present, the ordinary noises subdued in their turn for other griefs, other transitions, other moments of collective recognition that something has ended and something else has begun.